Everyone knows why John Carter failed. Bad marketing. Disney spent $250 million and forgot to tell anyone what the movie was about. They released a confusing trailer that looked like every other CGI spectacle. They gave it a generic title that sounded like a tax attorney's biopic. The studio panicked, the film tanked, someone lost their job, case closed. Film school lectures and YouTube video essays have been dining out on this story for over a decade. It's the perfect cautionary tale about corporate incompetence in the franchise era. Here's the problem. It's wrong. Not wrong that the marketing was bad, it was catastrophically incompetent. Not wrong that Disney lost a reported $200 million. Those are facts. What's wrong is the assumption that better marketing would have saved this film. That's the comfortable lie the industry tells itself because it avoids the uncomfortable truth. John Carter didn't fail because audiences didn't understand it. It failed because they understood it perfectly, and they rejected what they saw. John Carter isn't a fun space adventure that got marketed badly. It's a post-9/11 anti-war film about a traumatized veteran refusing to fight, disguised as a blockbuster, released into an audience that desperately wanted escapism. Andrew Stanton and his co-writers didn't just adapt Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1912 pulp novel, they systematically dismantled its jingoistic heroism and replaced it with PTSD, cynicism, and exhaustion. Then Disney tried to sell it as Avatar meets Star Wars. The cognitive dissonance between what the film actually is and what it pretended to be isn't a marketing failure. It's a Freudian slip that reveals everything about what America couldn't face in 2012. This isn't speculation. The evidence is in every frame, every choice, every deliberate deviation from the source material. Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter loved fighting. He was a Confederate cavalry officer who found paradise in Mars's endless wars. The book is unapologetic colonial fantasy white savior brings civilization through superior violence, its manifest destiny in space. Readers in 1912 ate it up because that's what adventure meant: conquest without consequences, glory without trauma. Stanton's film makes one radical change that transforms everything. This John Carter hates fighting. "I'm done with fighting," he says over and over. He's a deserter. He's running. He refuses causes, rejects recruitment, wants only to be left alone. When he arrives on Mars, a planet in the middle of a generations-long war, he doesn't see opportunity for glory. He sees another quagmire he wants no part of. This isn't heroic reluctance. This is clinical depression. This is a veteran who's seen too much. And here's what makes this textually explicit rather than interpretive. Stanton invented a dead wife and child for Carter. They don't exist in Burroughs. The entire Virginia backstory, the cabin, the massacre, the guilt, was manufactured for this film to give Carter PTSD that justifies his refusal to engage. The movie literalizes trauma as the source of his cynicism. That's not adapting a pulp adventure. That's importing the Hurt Locker into Flash Gordon. Look at what was happening in March 2012 when this film was released. The Iraq War had officially ended in December 2011, but everyone knew it was political theater. Troops were still dying, just in smaller numbers. Afghanistan was grinding into its 11th year with no end visible. American war fatigue was at its peak. Veterans were coming home to unemployment, PTSD diagnoses, and a country that wanted to say thank you for your service and then never think about what that service actually meant. The cultural conversation was exhausted. And into this moment, Disney released a $250 million blockbuster about a Civil War veteran who explicitly, repeatedly refuses to fight anymore. A film where the hero's defining characteristic is his desire to opt out, where the romantic interest literally asks him to save her world and he says no, where he watches genocide unfold and walks away, where every attempt to recruit him and both sides try constantly is met with, "I'm done." 2 months later, the Avengers made $1.5 billion by letting audiences cheer for violence again. Clean violence, justified violence. Violence with quips and a shawarma scene at the end. No PTSD, no moral ambiguity, no exhaustion. Just heroes doing hero things, and aren't we lucky they exist? The contrast is the point. America in 2012 knew what it wanted from its blockbusters, and it wasn't a meditation on the cost of endless war. The conventional wisdom treats John Carter as a case study in marketing malpractice. Business school textbooks will use it as an example of brand confusion for decades, and that analysis is useful if you want to understand how not to sell a movie. But it's useless if you want to understand why audiences stayed away even after word of mouth started saying it's actually pretty good. Because that did happen. There was a minor groundswell of unfairly malign discourse, people reassessing it on home video. It didn't matter. The film's reputation never recovered. Marketing can explain opening weekend. It can't explain cultural rejection. What can explain it is recognizing that John Carter is a fundamentally conflicted text. It's a 250 million blockbuster that doesn't believe in heroism. It's a franchise starter that's skeptical of the hero's journey. It's a spectacle film where the spectacle feels obligatory rather than triumphant. Critics called it uneven and couldn't quite articulate why. They sensed the tonal schizophrenia but blamed pacing or structure. What they were actually feeling was a film at war with itself, trying to be a fun adventure while simultaneously deconstructing the violence that adventure requires. This isn't a failure of execution. This is a failure of honesty. Stanton made a serious film about war trauma and then dressed it up in CGI aliens and arena battles because that's what 250 million buys you. The marketing didn't know how to sell it because the film itself doesn't know what it is. You can see Disney's panic in every trailer. They kept trying to find the fun, and it's not there. The fun is buried under symbolism and subtext and a protagonist whose emotional arc is learning to care again, rather than becoming a hero. Here's the thesis, explicit and inescapable. John Carter is a disguised interrogation of America's forever war syndrome, masquerading as a blockbuster adventure, and its catastrophic failure reveals more about what audiences refused to see in 2012 than any marketing campaign could explain. This reading isn't about rescuing a misunderstood masterpiece. John Carter has real problems, pacing issues, a convoluted frame story, uneven world building. But those problems are symptoms of its central contradiction. When you try to make a post-9/11 war film using the template of pre-WWI colonial adventure, something has to give. What gave was coherence. What remained was a film too serious for its genre and too genre-bound for its seriousness. The evidence is everywhere once you look. The visual contrast between desaturated Earth reality as exhaustion and vibrant Mars fantasy as escape, the way battle scenes are edited without triumphant music, just silence and consequence. Taylor Kitsch's deliberately flat performance that critics called wooden, but is actually playing clinical depression. The Therns as puppet master arms dealers, a wholesale invention that turns Mars's war into a Vietnam metaphor. The arena fight where Carter exhibits no joy in combat, just mechanical survival. The frame story that makes the entire narrative suspect is this, even what really happened, or just what a traumatized man tells himself. Most damningly, the ending. Carter finally chooses to fight, but only after establishing a personal stake. He's not fighting for a cause, he's fighting for a person. The film literalizes the only acceptable reason for a post-9/11 veteran to return to combat: individual love, not abstract ideals. No WMDs, no spreading democracy, just I need to protect her. That's the only motivation the film grants legitimacy. Everything else, nation, honor, duty, has been tried and found wanting. The cynicism is structural. And this is where it gets really interesting, Carter returns to Earth and spends 13 years desperately trying to get back to Mars. The final act is a veteran who can't adjust to peacetime, who experiences Earth as a prison, who needs the war even as he hates it. That's not adventure. That's the Hurt Locker's war is a drug, made literal. The film ends with Carter finding his way back, and we're supposed to cheer. But the subtext is horrifying. He's only alive when he's in combat. Peace is death. This is why the marketing failed. You can't sell this. You can't put traumatized veteran struggles with purpose in peacetime on a poster. You can't trailer cut PTSD flashbacks and depression into 2 minutes of crowd-pleasing spectacle. Disney tried, they desperately tried, and every attempt rang false because the film underneath is about the falseness of adventure narratives.dg. The debate has been about marketing for 14 years because that's easier than asking why audiences rejected a film that was, in many ways, telling them the truth about the previous decade of American military policy. It's easier than admitting that in 2012, exhausted by real wars, audiences wanted fantasy violence that didn't remind them of anything real. They wanted Loki falling from the sky, not John Carter sitting in a cave saying, "I'm done." So let's stop debating the marketing. Let's talk about what this film actually is, what it's actually saying, and why that was intolerable to an audience that would, just 8 weeks later, make The Avengers the third highest grossing film of all time. Let's talk about how John Carter accidentally became the most subversive blockbuster of the 2010s by taking a colonialist fantasy and turning it into an indictment of the very violence it's supposed to celebrate. Let's talk about why America couldn't watch John Carter say, "I'm done fighting," without looking away. So where's the proof? If John Carter really is a disguised anti-war film, the evidence needs to be in the text itself. Not in what we project onto it, but in what the film explicitly constructs. And it's there. Scene after scene, choice after choice, the film systematically dismantles heroic adventure and replaces it with trauma, refusal, and exhaustion. This isn't subtle. Once you're looking for it, it's almost overwhelming. The film practically announces what it's doing, and somehow both critics and audiences managed not to hear it. Let's organize this thematically because chronology would miss the pattern. The film's structure is fractured frame stories within flashbacks within memories, but its argument is coherent. We'll look at 5 categories of evidence: refusal as character, manufactured trauma, violence without joy, systemic manipulation, and the only acceptable reason to fight. Each one reveals how thoroughly this film has inverted the source material's values. Refusal as character. Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter is defined by his willingness to fight. He's a cavalryman who finds purpose in combat, a man who belongs on battlefields. The novel's opening establishes him as someone who thrives in war. That's the archetype, the warrior who finds his true self through violence. It's every action hero from Achilles to John Rambo. Whirl. Stanton's John Carter says, "I'm done fighting," and means it. Whirl. This isn't reluctant hero needs, convincing. This is active refusal. Watch the early scenes on Earth before Mars even enters the picture. Carter is arrested, escapes, gets arrested again, not because he's pursued by villains, but because he's running from employment. The Union cavalry wants to recruit him for the Apache Wars. He says no. They draft him. He escapes. They catch him. He escapes again. The film spends its entire first act on a man trying to avoid being a soldier. This is the opposite of a hero's journey. This is someone fleeing the call to adventure, and he's explicit about why. When Colonel Powell, his old friend, someone he respects, asks him to rejoin, to fight for a cause, Carter says, "I don't have a woman to protect," not, "I don't have a woman waiting for me," or "I have no one to fight for." The phrasing is crucial, to protect. He's identifying the hero's classic motivation and declaring he lacks it, therefore he lacks purpose. He's deconstructing his own archetype in real time. The film returns to this refrain obsessively. On Mars, when the Tharks want him to fight, when Dejah Thoris needs him to fight, when literally the fate of a civilization hangs in the balance, he says, "No, I'm done with causes, not this specific cause. Causes, the abstract concept of fighting for something larger than yourself." The film puts the entire edifice of heroic narrative in his mouth and has him reject it. Critics called this unlikable or difficult to root for. They're not wrong, but they're missing why the film makes this choice. This isn't bad characterization. This is deliberate alienation. The film is testing whether an audience raised on heroic fantasy can accept a protagonist who has seen through the fantasy and wants out. The answer, as it turned out, was no.ul. There's a scene early on Mars where Carter is captured by the Tharks, the four-armed green Martians, and they're trying to determine what he is. He demonstrates his Earth-strength jumping ability, and Tars Tarkas, the Thark leader, immediately sees military value. "You could be a great warrior," he says, paraphrasing the sentiment, if not the exact dialogue. Carter's response is to walk away, not even respond, just done with this conversation. Later, when the Tharks are attacked by white apes in the arena, Carter fights, but watch his face. Taylor Kitsch plays it with zero exhilaration, no joy, no discovery of dormant heroism, just mechanical survival. He's good at killing because he's had to be good at killing, and he hates that about himself. When it's over, there's no triumph. He looks at the bodies and you can see him calculating. How many more times will he have to do this? This is the film showing us that violence, even spectacular CGI violence with alien creatures, is exhausting labor. It's a job you perform to survive, not an expression of heroic identity. That's the post-9/11 veteran experience made visible. You don't come home from deployment talking about glory, you come home talking about getting through it. The film imports that sensibility into a genre built on the opposite assumption. And here's where it gets textually explicit. The cave opening. Before we meet Carter on Earth, before we know anything about him, the film opens with his nephew being summoned to a cave where Carter's body lies. Carter has sealed himself in, left instructions that only his nephew can enter, and written a manuscript. This framing device, which doesn't exist in Burroughs, establishes that Carter ended his life in hiding. Whatever happened to him, wherever he went, he came back and isolated himself from the world. That's not how adventure stories end. That's how trauma narratives end. The hero can't reintegrate. The war, literal or metaphorical, has made him incompatible with peace. The film begins by telling us this story ends in self-imposed exile. That's not a frame, that's a warning. Manufactured trauma. But why is Carter like this? Burroughs never explains his character's past in detail. He's just an adventurer, a gentleman soldier, a type. Stanton couldn't accept that. A modern audience needs psychology. They need reason. So the film manufactures a backstory that doesn't exist in the source material. Virginia, the wife and child, the cabin massacre. This is the most significant change in the entire adaptation, and it's barely discussed because it happens in fragmented flashbacks. But let's be clear about what this does. It gives Carter PTSD to justify his cynicism. It literalizes trauma as the origin of his refusal to fight. The film is saying explicitly that war, the Civil War, in which Carter presumably fought before retiring to his cabin, plus personal loss, the massacre, equals a broken man who cannot be reached by appeals to duty or honor. Watch how the Virginia flashbacks are structured. They're not clean memories. They're fragments. A laugh, a door opening, flames, silence. That's not exposition. That's trauma memory. The way PTSD flashbacks actually function. Disconnected sensory details without narrative coherence. The film is using editing technique to place us inside post-traumatic recall. It's showing us how Carter experiences his own past as shards that cut him every time he touches them. And here's the crucial thing. The film never shows us the actual attack. We see the aftermath. Bodies, fire, Carter collapsing, but not the event itself. This could be restraint, avoiding gratuitous violence, or it could be something else, the unknowability of trauma. The thing that broke Carter is the thing he can't fully reconstruct, even in his own memory. It's a wound that won't close because he can't fully see it. This backstory is a pure invention. Stanton and his co-writers could have adapted the book faithfully, giving Carter the straightforward motivation Burroughs provided. Instead, they built a trauma architecture around him. They pathologized his heroism. In Burroughs, Carter is a Confederate officer who heads west for adventure. He's basically still fighting the war, just with different enemies. In Stanton, Carter is a Confederate deserter who watched his family die and now trusts nothing and no one. That's not an adaptation. That's a critique.u. The Virginia backstory does something else too. It makes Carter's refusal sympathetic. Without it, he's just a coward or a cynic. With it, he's a traumatized veteran who's seen too much loss. The film is deliberately creating a psychological justification for refusing the hero's journey. It's saying, what if the call to adventure comes to someone who's already been destroyed by adventure? What if the hero is too damaged to hero anymore? That's a profoundly post-9/11 question. The United States spent a decade asking young people to deploy, redeploy, deploy again, extending tours, calling up reservists, sending soldiers back into combat zones with insufficient dwell time between rotations. The result was an epidemic of PTSD, TBI, and moral injury. By 2012, the country was beginning to reckon with the cost of asking the same people to fight endless wars. And here's John Carter asking, what does a society do when its warriors say, I'm done? The film doesn't have an answer. It just has the question, embedded in Carter's backstory, literalized as family graves in Virginia soil. Violence without joy. Let's talk about the arena. In a traditional blockbuster, especially one based on pulp adventure, the arena fight is a set piece. It's where the hero discovers his power, earns respect, becomes the champion the plot needs him to be. It's gladiator fantasy, the moment where violence transforms from threat to empowerment. Think of Gladiator itself, or Thor, or any number of films where the arena is a crucible of heroic identity. John Carter's arena fight is nothing like that. Carter is thrown into the ring against two white apes, massive CGI creatures designed to feel overwhelming. He doesn't want to be there. He tries to avoid fighting. When the violence starts, there's no stirring music. Michael Giacchino's score doesn't swell with triumph. Instead, we get tense, percussive action beats that feel more like horror than adventure. And Carter's face throughout, exhausted, doing what he has to do. Survival, not glory. When he kills the first ape, there's no pause for the crowd to cheer and the hero to absorb their adoration. The second ape attacks immediately. Carter is forced to keep moving, keep fighting, keep killing. It's relentless. And when it's finally over, when both creatures are dead and the Tharks are roaring approval, Carter just stands there. He doesn't raise his fist. He doesn't smile. He looks at the carnage, and you can see him thinking, this again. The film is deliberately withholding the pleasure of the spectacle. It spent millions of dollars creating this sequence, and then it refuses to let the audience enjoy it. That's almost perverse. It's like buying a roller coaster and then pointing out how unsafe it is while people are riding it. But that's the point. The film is saying, this is what violence actually is. Not adventure, not excitement, just exhausting, repeated trauma. Compare this to The Avengers, released 2 months later, where every action sequence is scored for maximum exhilaration, where the heroes quip during fights, where combat is a form of play. The Hulk smashing Loki is played for laughs. Thor and Iron Man fighting each other is almost flirtatious. Violence in The Avengers is consequence-free fun. Violence in John Carter is labor that extracts a cost every time. There's another fight later where Carter faces a squad of Zodangan soldiers, the human-appearing Martians, who serve as the film's more conventional bad guys. He's trying to reach Deja before her forced wedding. The fight is technically impressive. Good choreography, solid effects, but again, watch the tone. Carter moves through opponents efficiently, mechanically, without flair. He's not enjoying this. He's just getting it done. And when he finally reaches Deja, he's not triumphant. He's exhausted. This is the film's most radical formal choice. It stages action sequences with all the craft and expense of a blockbuster, then deliberately undercuts the emotional release those sequences are supposed to provide. It's giving the audience what they paid for while simultaneously making them feel bad about wanting it. That's commercial suicide, but it's also thematically coherent. If the thesis is that violence extracts a cost that adventure narratives ignore, then the film has to make the audience feel that cost, even in fantasy combat. The result is a film that feels flat to audiences expecting propulsive excitement. Critics noted this. Lacks energy, feels weirdly muted. They're describing the symptom, not the disease. The film is muted by design because it's about a man who's gone numb to violence. The aesthetic reflects the psychology, Topsha systemic manipulation. Now let's talk about the Therns. In Burroughs' novels, the Therns are a race of false gods, white-skinned Martians who perpetuate a religious hoax. They're villains, but localized ones, relevant to specific books in the series. They're not puppet masters orchestrating Mars's entire geopolitical situation. In Stanton's film, the Therns are something else entirely, alien manipulators who have been extending Mars's war for their own purposes. Mark Strong's Matai Shang is introduced as a seemingly neutral figure, but it's quickly revealed that he's playing both sides. He gives weapons to one faction, then balances it by giving intelligence to the other. He doesn't want anyone to win. He wants the war to continue. E.g. This is a wholesale invention, and it transforms the film's politics entirely. Suddenly, Mars's endless war isn't a tragedy of cultural conflict or resource scarcity. It's manufactured, maintained, profitable to someone. The film takes a straightforward adventure plot and injects a conspiracy that makes every battle feel like it's serving someone else's agenda. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? The Therns are war profiteers. They're Halliburton. They're the military-industrial complex. They're every cynical reading of American foreign policy from Vietnam to Iraq made literal. They're the answer to the question, cui bono? Who benefits from endless war? Not the people fighting it, not the civilizations destroying themselves. The ones standing outside the system, feeding the machine, making sure it never stops. And here's Matai Shang's most revealing moment. When Carter confronts him, Shang doesn't even try to justify his actions morally. He talks about cycles, about civilizations rising and falling, about his people's role as gardeners pruning the excess. It's the language of inevitability, of realpolitik, of this is just how things are. It's the rhetoric used to justify every forever war. We're not the cause. We're just managing the chaos. We're just managing the chaos. We're just ensuring stability. It's monstrous, and the film knows it. But more importantly, it makes every fight Carter gets into compromised. Is he fighting for Deja's people, or is he just playing his role in someone else's script? When he finally defeats the Zodangans, has he actually changed anything, or has he just moved pieces around on a board the Therns control? The film doesn't answer these questions cleanly, and that ambiguity is the point. Once you introduce the idea that the conflict is manufactured, you can't go back to uncomplicated heroism. And both sides recruit him. The Zodangans want him as a weapon. Helium wants him as a savior. The Tharks want him as a warrior. Everyone sees Carter as a tool, something to be deployed for their purposes. No one asks what he wants. No one cares about his trauma. They care about his utility. This is how veterans describe military service in critical mode. You're an asset, not a person. Your skills are resources to be extracted. Thank you for your service really means thank you for being usable. And Carter, throughout the film, is constantly being recruited, persuaded, manipulated into fighting someone else's war for someone else's reasons. His refusal, then, isn't cowardice. It's resistance to being instrumentalized. When he says, "I'm done with causes," he's saying, "I'm done being your weapon. I'm done having my violence be in service to systems I don't control." That's not generic war weariness. That's specific political consciousness about how militaries use people. The Therns make this text rather than subtext. They're the mechanism that reveals the machinery. And their inclusion, entirely invented for this film, is evidence that Stanton was doing something far more political than a faithful Burroughs adaptation would allow. U. The only acceptable reason to fight. So what finally gets Carter to fight? not honor, not duty, not saving civilization. He watches helium fall, watches genocide unfold, and he leaves. He makes a deal with Matai Shang, who reveals himself fully as a villain at this point, to return Carter to Earth in exchange for his non-interference. And Carter takes the deal. He walks away. The hero of this blockbuster film abandons the people who need him. Let that sit for a moment. The film's second act break is the protagonist choosing to let everyone die rather than fight. That's not a low point to overcome. That's a moral failure that most adventure narratives would never allow. But this film allows it because it's proving the thesis. Abstract causes aren't enough. Saving helium is a cause. Stopping the Zodangans is a cause. Preserving Martian civilization is a cause. And Carter has been broken enough times by causes that he won't touch them anymore. What changes? Deja. Specifically, the forced wedding. Carter returns to Earth, we'll get to that ending later, and realizes he can't live with abandoning her. Not her city, not her people, her. The film makes this explicitly personal. His voiceover clarifies he's not going back for Mars. He's going back for a person he loves. This is the only motivation the film grants legitimacy. Personal love. Individual connection, not abstract ideals, not patriotism, not moral duty, just, I cannot let this specific person be harmed. That's the thesis-made structure. The film spends 2 hours demonstrating that grand narratives are insufficient motivation for a traumatized veteran to return to combat. Only intimate human connection can reach him, and even that's compromised, because by the time Carter gets back to Mars, Deja has already married Subverting, the Zodangan prince, sacrificing herself to save her people. So Carter's motivation, personal love, arrives too late. He fights anyway, and he wins, but the film has already shown us that his reasons for fighting are inadequate to the geopolitical situation he's fighting within. He's not solving Mars's problems. He's rescuing one person from a system that will continue grinding forward. The film ends with the Zodangans defeated and the Therns temporarily thwarted, but Matai Shang escapes. The system remains. Carter has won a battle, a personal battle, but the war continues. The film denies him and us the satisfaction of complete victory, because complete victory would require dismantling the machinery of endless conflict. And the film's entire worldview is that such machinery is self-sustaining. This is as close as a 250 million Disney film gets to saying, individual heroism cannot solve systemic problems. You can save the person you love. You cannot save the world. The best you can do is operate at the scale of intimate human relationship and accept that the larger nightmare continues. That's a profoundly cynical message for a blockbuster. It's also the lesson a generation of veterans learned between 2001 and 2012. You can complete your mission. You cannot win the war. The war is bigger than you, designed by people you'll never meet, for purposes you'll never understand, and your heroism only matters to the people immediately around you. Everything else is theater. John Carter embeds this worldview into its structure and then tries to sell itself as a fun space adventure. The contradiction is the film. The failure was inevitable. You're probably thinking, this is an elaborate reading of a film that simply failed for obvious reasons. The marketing was catastrophic. The budget was bloated. Andrew Stanton had never directed live action before. Disney panicked and sabotaged their own film with that generic title and confused trailers. Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation is correct. Bad business decisions sank a mediocre movie. Why construct a political allegory out of corporate incompetence? Jar. That's the objection, and it deserves serious engagement. Because if the marketing failure narrative fully explains John Carter's box office disaster, then everything I've argued is just overreading, finding patterns that don't exist, projecting contemporary concerns onto a film that simply didn't work. So let's examine the counter-arguments carefully, not to dismiss them, but to test whether they actually account for what happened or whether they're comfortable lies that avoid harder questions. Counter-argument 1. The marketing was so bad it explains everything. This is the dominant narrative, and it's not wrong about the facts. Disney's marketing campaign for John Carter was a masterclass in self-sabotage. They removed "Of Mars" from the title, supposedly because "Mars Needs Moms" had flopped the previous year, as if audiences maintain a spreadsheet of Red Planet references. They released a Super Bowl trailer that told viewers nothing about the story, just showed a guy jumping around a desert. They failed to communicate genre, tone, or stakes. The campaign reeked of studio panic, of executives who didn't understand what they had and were terrified to commit to any clear positioning. And yes, that hurt the film, obviously. Marketing matters. A confused campaign depresses opening weekend. Word of mouth can't save a film if no one shows up in the first place. The $30 million domestic opening was catastrophic for a $250 million production. Disney lost approximately $200 million when all was counted. Those are real consequences of real marketing failures. But here's what this narrative doesn't explain. The film didn't just fail opening weekend. It collapsed completely and never recovered. Even as some critics and viewers started saying it's actually better than you think. Even as the home video release generated some unfairly maligned discourse, the cultural consensus remained. John Carter is a disaster. The film has never been reclaimed the way other box office bombs have been. It exists in popular memory as pure failure. Marketing can explain why people didn't show up. It cannot explain why the people who did show up didn't evangelize for it. It cannot explain why positive word of mouth never gained traction. It cannot explain why, 14 years later, the film's reputation remains toxic despite being readily available on streaming and home video. Consider The Shawshank Redemption. Terrible marketing. Bombed theatrically. Then, word of mouth and home video turned it into one of the most beloved films ever made. Or Fight Club. Marketing that confused audiences, poor box office, then cult classic status. Or Blade Runner. Or The Thing. History is full of films that overcame bad marketing through sheer quality and audience passion. John Carter had defenders. People who saw it said, "This is actually pretty good." Some called it unfairly maligned, but it never achieved redemption. Why? If the only problem was marketing, then direct audience contact with the film should have corrected the misperception. It didn't. The film remained rejected. This suggests the marketing wasn't the cause, but the symptom. Disney couldn't market John Carter effectively because the film itself is fundamentally confused about what it is. You can see the panic in the trailers because the studio watched the finished film and couldn't figure out how to sell it. Is it a romance, an action-adventure, a war film, a fish-out-of-water comedy? The film contains elements of all these genres without committing to any. That's not a marketing problem. That's a tonal problem that makes marketing impossible. The thesis I'm arguing, that John Carter is a covert anti-war film, explains why the marketing failed. You cannot sell a film about trauma and refusal as a fun space adventure. The cognitive dissonance is too great. Disney tried, and every attempt rang false. The marketing failed because it was lying about the product, and audiences can smell dishonesty even when they can't articulate why. So yes, the marketing was terrible. But terrible marketing is downstream of a confused film. And the film is confused because it's trying to be two things at once, a $250 million blockbuster and a serious meditation on violence and trauma. Those two imperatives are incompatible. The marketing collapsed under the weight of that incompatibility. Blaming the marketing lets everyone avoid asking the harder question, why did Disney spend $250 million on this version of this story? Counterargument? 2. It's just a faithful adaptation that felt derivative. This argument goes, Stanton tried to adapt Edgar Rice Burroughs faithfully, but the material is over a century old. Everything that was innovative in 1912 has been copied 1,000 times. By 2012, John Carter looked like a ripoff of Star Wars and Avatar, even though it technically predated both source-wise. The film felt generic not because of any political subtext, but because pulp adventure tropes have been exhausted. It's not deep. It's just old. There's truth here. Burroughs' Mars books influenced everything from Flash Gordon to Star Wars. And by the time John Carter reached screens, audiences had seen the hero's journey on alien planets executed dozens of times with bigger budgets and better effects. The white savior on alien planet narrative was already feeling dated in 2012. Avatar had done it 3 years earlier with more spectacle. The film was arriving late to its own party. But this reading assumes Stanton was trying to do faithful adaptation. The evidence contradicts this. The Virginia backstory, Carter's dead wife and child, doesn't exist in Burroughs. Book Carter loves fighting, film Carter hates it and says so explicitly. The Thern's role is massively expanded and changed from minor villains to systemic puppet masters. The frame story with the nephew is altered. The ending is different. These aren't minor changes or updates for pacing. These are fundamental alterations to character motivation, thematic content, and political subtext. Stanton wasn't making a faithful adaptation. He was doing a radical reinterpretation while pretending to honor the source material. That's not the same thing. The film looks like pulp adventure. It has the trappings, the visual vocabulary, the genre markers. But underneath, it's systematically deconstructing what those tropes mean. That's why it felt off to audiences. Not because it was too faithful, but because it was unfaithful in ways that created tonal whiplash. If Stanton had actually adapted Burroughs faithfully, he would have given us a Confederate officer who arrives on Mars and immediately starts conquering, because that's what adventurers do. That character would be problematic in 2012. The colonialism would be front and center. The white savior narrative would be uncomfortable, but at least it would be coherent. Instead, Stanton kept the structure of colonial adventure while removing the colonial enthusiasm. He wanted to critique the genre while working within it. The result satisfies neither the audience that wants straightforward pulp nor the audience that wants political sophistication. So the faithful adaptation defense doesn't hold. This isn't a film that aged poorly. It's a film that deliberately changed the source material to inject post-9/11 sensibilities into pre-WWI adventure fiction. That's a choice, not an inevitability. And choices have consequences. Counter-argument. 3. Andrew Stanton just made a bad film. The simplest objection, maybe there's no deep political subtext. Maybe Stanton, brilliant as he is at animation, simply failed at live-action filmmaking. The pacing is off. The world building is confusing. The framing device with the nephew is clunky. Taylor Kitsch's performance is flat. The dialogue is exposition-heavy. These are craft failures, not political statements. Sometimes a mediocre film is just a mediocre film. This argument has merit. This argument has merit. John Carter has real problems. The script juggles too many elements. Frame story, flashbacks, multiple factions on Mars, the Thern's machinations, and doesn't always balance them successfully. The first act on Earth drags. The exposition about Martian politics is dense. Some of the CGI, while expensive, doesn't fully convince. These are legitimate craft issues. But craft failures don't explain the film's specific tonal qualities. A film can be badly paced and still be tonally coherent. John Carter isn't incoherent in the usual ways. Meandering plot, unclear stakes, inconsistent characterization. Its problems are more fundamental. The tone itself is wrong for the genre it's pretending to be. Adventure films are propulsive. This one feels leaden. Action films make violence exciting. This one makes violence exhausting. Heroes' journey narratives build to the protagonist embracing their destiny. This one builds to the protagonist choosing personal connection over grand purpose. Those aren't accidents. They're consistent choices that all point in the same direction, away from triumphant adventure towards something more somber and complicated. You can make those choices badly, and in some ways Stanton does, but you can't make them accidentally. The film's tonal peculiarity is too persistent to be mere incompetence. And let's talk about Taylor Kitsch's performance, which critics called wooden or lacking charisma. Fair enough, he's not bringing the roguish charm that someone like Chris Pratt would inject into similar material. But watch the performance as an intentional choice to play depression. Carter barely smiles. His voice is flat. He makes minimal eye contact. He's physically capable. The action scenes showcase that, but emotionally checked out. That's not bad acting. That's specific acting for a character who's numb. If Stanton wanted charismatic adventure, he would have directed Kitsch to play it differently, or he would have recast. Instead, he kept the performance that feels wrong for a pulp hero, but right for a traumatized veteran. That's either directorial incompetence or directorial intention. And given that every other aspect of the film, the invented backstory, the refusal refrain, the violence without joy approach, points toward the same interpretation, intention seems more likely than incompetence. The bad film argument also doesn't explain why the film's specific failures feel so odd. If this were just generic blockbuster mediocrity, it would fail in familiar ways. Too much CGI, nonsensical plot, cardboard characters. Instead, it fails by being emotionally inaccessible. Audiences couldn't connect to Carter not because he's poorly written, but because he's written as someone who refuses connection. That's a different kind of failure. It's the failure of a film that's deliberately pushing its audience away. So yes, Stanton made a flawed film, but the flaws are symptomatic of the deeper contradiction, trying to make an anti-war film using the structure of pro-war adventure. The craft problems emerge from that impossible task. You can't make a $250 million Disney blockbuster that's secretly about the futility of heroic violence and expect it to work commercially. The genre and the message are at war with each other. The casualties are pacing, tone, and audience satisfaction. The synthesis. Why all three objections? Miss the point. Here's what all three counterarguments have in common. They treat John Carter's failure as explicable through normal film industry analysis. Bad marketing happens. Dated source material happens. Directors fail at new formats. These are all true and all insufficient because none of them explain why this specific film failed in this specific way at this specific moment. Why couldn't Disney market it? Because the film is about refusal and audiences wanted engagement. Why did the adaptation feel off? Because Stanton changed the source material to inject war trauma into pulp adventure. Why did the craft fail? Because the film's political message and commercial genre are incompatible. The marketing, the adaptation choices, and the tonal problems are all symptoms of the same cause. John Carter is a film that doesn't believe in what it's supposed to be. It's a blockbuster that's skeptical of blockbuster values. It's an adventure film about someone who's done with adventure. And it was released into an audience that was just beginning to want uncomplicated heroism again after a decade of complicated, morally ambiguous wars. 2 months later, the Avengers made $1.5 billion. That film had no ambiguity about violence, no trauma, no exhaustion, just heroes being heroic, and audiences could love them without reservation. The contrast isn't coincidental, it's diagnostic. 2012 was the year American audiences decided they wanted their fantasy violence clean again. John Carter offered them dirty violence, complicated violence, violence that extracted a cost, and they rejected it. DC. So the counter-arguments are right about the details and wrong about the cause. Yes, the marketing failed because the film is unmarketable. Yes, the adaptation felt derivative because it was trying to subvert what it was imitating. Yes, Stanton made craft mistakes because the film he was trying to make was structurally impossible within the blockbuster format. The failure isn't mysterious, it's overdetermined. Everything about John Carter pointed toward commercial disaster, because the film is fundamentally at odds with the genre it inhabits and the audience it's targeting. You can analyze the marketing, the source material, and the craft, but until you address the political and tonal contradictions at the film's core, you're treating symptoms instead of disease. And the disease is this. In 2012, America wasn't ready to watch a film that told them heroic violence is a lie that traumatizes everyone who participates in it. They wanted the lie. They needed the lie. The Avengers gave them the lie, and they loved it. John Carter tried to split the difference, give them the spectacle while undermining the meaning, and both audiences and critics could feel the contradiction even if they couldn't name it. The counter-arguments explain how John Carter failed. The thesis explains why it had to fail. That's the difference. And that's why the bad marketing narrative has dominated for 14 years. It's easier than admitting that audiences rejected the film's message, even when they couldn't articulate what that message was. Let's zoom out. Because John Carter doesn't fail in a vacuum. It fails at a specific moment, in a specific cultural context, as a specific response to specific anxieties. And understanding that context, the America of March 2012, what it had just been through, what it desperately wanted to believe, is essential to understanding why this film couldn't find an audience. The rejection wasn't about marketing or craft. It was about timing. It was about a country that had spent a decade at war and was desperately trying to convince itself that war could still mean something heroic. The centennial problem. Start with the source material's birthday. Edgar Rice Burroughs published A Princess of Mars, the novel John Carter adapts in 1912. The film was released in 2012, almost exactly 100 years later. That's not just a neat coincidence. It's a diagnostic contrast that reveals everything about how American culture understands violence, heroism, and empire. 1912, the United States is an ascending power. The Spanish-American War is recent memory, a quick, successful imperial venture that gave America overseas territories. The Philippines are being pacified through military occupation. The frontier is officially closed, but the frontier spirit conquest, adventure, the civilizing mission is still the defining American mythology. Teddy Roosevelt, who literally charged up San Juan Hill, left the presidency just 4 years earlier. This is the cultural moment that produces Burroughs' John Carter, a Confederate officer who goes west for gold, ends up on Mars, and immediately starts conquering because that's what men of action do. Burroughs' novel is unapologetic imperial fantasy. Carter is explicitly superior, stronger, faster, more capable than the Martians he encounters. He rises through Thark society, not through diplomacy, but through combat prowess. He wins the princess through heroic action. The novel never questions whether conquest is good. It assumes conquest is the point. Adventure means domination. Heroism means winning. The moral universe is simple. There are civilized people who deserve power and barbarous people who must be subdued. Carter brings order through superior violence. That's not subtext. That's the text. 1912 audiences loved this because it reflected their worldview back to them. America was strong, right, and destined for greatness. Violence in service of civilization wasn't tragic, it was glorious. The frontier spirit could be exported to other planets. The hero's journey meant ascending to rulership. White male competence would naturally dominate any environment. These weren't controversial ideas, they were assumptions. Now jump forward 100 years. 2012, the United States has spent the last decade in 2 simultaneous wars, neither of which it has won. Iraq was supposed to be quick, mission accomplished in May 2003, but turned into a grinding occupation that killed hundreds of thousands and achieved nothing resembling victory. Afghanistan, the good war, the necessary response to 9/11, is now in its 11th year with no end visible. American power doesn't feel ascendant. It feels exhausted. The cultural conversation has shifted entirely. The frontier spirit now looks like imperialism. The civilizing mission now looks like occupation. Superior violence now looks like war crimes. Abu Ghraib, Haditha, civilian casualties from drone strikes. The hero who conquers through combat prowess now looks like a war criminal. The assumptions of 1912 are the atrocities of 2012. And into this moment, Disney releases a $250 million film based on 1912's fantasy of heroic conquest. Except Stanton and his writers know they can't just give audiences 1912 Carter. That character is morally intolerable to a 2012 audience. So they change him, make him traumatized, cynical, refusing to fight. They try to update the colonialist fantasy for post-9/11 sensibilities. They're still making a blockbuster that requires spectacle, action, adventure. The form and the content are at war. The centennial gap is the fault line the film splits along. This isn't just John Carter's problem. This is Hollywood's problem with the entire adventure genre post-9/11. How do you make films about heroic violence when actual violence has been revealed as anything but heroic? How do you celebrate military competence when the military has been bogged down in unwinnable wars? How do you tell empire stories when empire is the villain? Some films lean into the critique. The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, smaller films that engage seriously with war trauma. Some films dodge the issue entirely by going fantasy. The Lord of the Rings, superhero films, violence and context so removed from reality that the moral questions don't apply. John Carter tries to split the difference, use the fantasy setting, but import the real-world trauma. It's trying to be both Avatar and The Hurt Locker. It succeeds at neither because the impulses cancel each other out. The centennial gap explains why. Burroughs' novel reflects a culture confident in its violence. Stanton's film reflects a culture ashamed of its violence, but still wanting to enjoy the spectacle. That contradiction is unsustainable. The film collapses under the weight of trying to be 1912 and 2012 simultaneously. March 2012, the specific moment. Let's narrow the focus. John Carter was released March 9, 2012. What was happening in America at that exact moment? The Iraq War had officially ended in December 2011 when the last U.S. combat troops withdrew. Officially. In reality, thousands of contractors remained. The country was fragmenting into sectarian violence that would eventually birth ISIS, and no one seriously believed the mission had been accomplished. But politically, domestically, the war was over. America could pretend it was done with Iraq. Afghanistan was another story. Still fully engaged, still losing soldiers monthly, still with no clear path to victory or withdrawal. But it had faded from front-page news. The war had become background noise, a thing that happened somewhere else to other people. Troop levels were down from the 2010 surge, but tens of thousands of Americans were still deployed in a conflict most citizens had stopped thinking about. This is war fatigue made policy. America was exhausted. The initial post-9/11 unity had long since shattered. The Iraq War had proven to be based on false intelligence. The Afghanistan War had dragged on past any reasonable definition of success. The costs in blood, treasure, and moral standing were visible to anyone paying attention. But there was no political will to fully reckon with what had been done. The wars were winding down, not because they'd been won, but because everyone was tired of talking about them. Occupy Wall Street had erupted the previous fall, and while the encampments were gone by March 2012, the discourse remained. We are the 99% entered the vocabulary. There was widespread anger about inequality, about the rich profiting while everyone else suffered, about systems rigged to benefit the few at the expense of the many. This wasn't specifically about war, but it was about who pays costs and who reaps benefits. And military service, which draws disproportionately from working-class communities, fits that pattern. The 99% fight the wars, the 1% profit from them. Obama was in his first term, running for re-election. His administration had officially ended Iraq, was drawing down Afghanistan, but had also vastly expanded drone warfare. Targeted killings were happening in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, a new kind of warfare that was supposed to be precise, surgical, low cost. But the moral questions were just displaced, not resolved. Killing by remote control doesn't eliminate the trauma or the ethical complexity. It just makes it easier to ignore. This is the context. A country officially done with war but still fighting. A population exhausted by a decade of conflict but unwilling to fully confront what that conflict meant. A political moment where anger about systemic manipulation was front and center, and a blockbuster landscape dominated by escapist fantasy because reality had become intolerable. John Carter arrives into this moment with a protagonist who says, "I'm done fighting," and actually means it. A film where both sides of a conflict are manipulated by external forces for profit. A film where the hero abandons the cause because causes have proven hollow. A film where violence extracts a visible cost rather than providing catharsis. In other words, a film that reflected the moment too accurately to be enjoyable. 2 months later, The Avengers as countertext. Here's the most revealing comparison. The Avengers was released May 4, 2012, less than 2 months after John Carter. It made $1.5 billion worldwide. It became a cultural phenomenon. It launched the MCU into dominance. And it is, in every way, the opposite of what John Carter is trying to do. The Avengers is about competent people using violence to solve problems. The heroes are powerful, the villains are clear, the stakes are understandable, and the violence is consequence-free fun. When the Hulk smashes things, it's played for laughs. When Iron Man blows up alien ships, it's triumphant. When the team finally assembles and starts working together, the audience cheers because good people doing good violence is good. The film asks nothing of its audience except that they enjoy the spectacle. No one in the Avengers has PTSD. No one questions whether fighting is worthwhile. No one says, "I'm done with causes." Tony Stark is traumatized by the Battle of New York, but that doesn't happen until the next film. The Avengers itself is trauma-free. These are heroes who enjoy being heroes. The film doesn't interrogate violence, it celebrates it. And audiences in 2012 desperately needed that celebration. Because here's what a decade of real war had done. It had made audiences hungry for fantasy war where the moral questions didn't apply. The Avengers works because it's so clearly divorced from reality that no one has to think about Iraq or Afghanistan while watching it. Aliens invade. Heroes stop them. Shawarma. Done. The violence is completely sanitized, completely justified, completely enjoyable. There's no collateral damage that matters, no civilians who suffer, no soldiers who come home broken, just victory. John Carter couldn't offer that, even though it's also set on an alien planet, even though it's also fantasy, it imported the real-world exhaustion into the fantasy space. Carter's trauma is Earth trauma, civil war, dead family, existential weariness. The Mars conflict mirrors real conflicts, endless war, puppet masters, profiteers. The violence doesn't feel fun, it feels like work. The film is asking audiences to watch fantasy violence while thinking about real violence, and that's intolerable. The 2-month gap between releases is almost too perfect. It's like a controlled experiment. What happens if you give audiences post-9/11 war trauma in a blockbuster versus pre-9/11 moral simplicity? The answer, one makes $30 million domestic opening weekend and becomes a legendary flop. The other makes $207 million opening weekend and defines the next decade of blockbuster filmmaking. EW. The contrast isn't just commercial, it's diagnostic. America in 2012 was choosing what kind of fantasy it wanted, and it chose the fantasy that let it forget rather than the fantasy that reminded it. John Carter failed not despite being more honest about violence, but because it was more honest. Audiences didn't want honesty. They wanted Loki getting Hulk smashed. veteran discourse, and the invisible war. There's another layer here that matters. What was happening with veteran culture in 2012? Because John Carter is explicitly about a veteran, not metaphorically, literally. He's a Civil War soldier, but the film codes him as a modern veteran through every choice it makes. The PTSD, the isolation, the refusal to discuss what happened, the inability to reintegrate into civilian life. This is contemporary veteran experience transplanted to a Western setting. By 2012, PTSD was finally being discussed seriously in mainstream culture. The previous decade had seen an explosion in diagnosis rates as the wars produced hundreds of thousands of veterans with trauma. The VA was overwhelmed. Suicide rates among veterans were climbing. Homelessness, unemployment, substance abuse. The country was beginning to reckon with the fact that support the troops rhetoric didn't translate to actual support for people coming home damaged. There was a specific discourse around veterans who spoke against the wars. Organizations like Iraq Veterans Against the War were giving voice to soldiers who felt betrayed, who questioned the missions they'd been sent on, who refused the hero narrative. These were people saying, essentially, I'm done fighting. The exact words John Carter repeats. They were being called unpatriotic, accused of disrespecting their own service, told that protesting the war meant disrespecting the warriors. The cultural conversation was hostile to veterans who refused to validate the wars they'd fought. John Carter gives us a protagonist who embodies that refusal. He's a veteran who won't fight anymore, who questions causes, who sees through recruitment rhetoric, and he's the hero. The film is siding with the veteran against the recruiters, against the systems that want to use him, against the ideology that says real men always answer the call. That's a radical position, and it's buried inside a Disney blockbuster where most audiences won't even notice it. But they felt it. Even if they couldn't articulate why Carter felt unlikable or hard to root for, they were reacting to the fact that he violates the hero archetype. Heroes don't refuse. Heroes don't question. Heroes sacrifice themselves for others. Carter does none of these things until he's found the one motivation, personal love, that the film grants legitimacy. Everything else is insufficient. 9. This is the film saying, the traditional reasons men go to war, duty, honor, country, glory, are hollow. Only intimate human connection justifies violence. That's a post-9/11 veteran speaking. That's someone who's been sold a narrative and lived through the reality. And in 2012, that voice was still too threatening to mainstream culture. We wanted heroes who believed in the mission. Carter doesn't believe in the mission. That makes him dangerous. The politics of spectacle. There's a broader context about blockbuster filmmaking in 2012 that matters. This was the peak of a specific approach to franchise building, expensive, effects, heavy, intellectually undemanding spectacle designed for global markets. Avatar had proven in 2009 that you could make $2.7 billion with a visually stunning film that had a simplistic story. The lesson Hollywood learned was, invest in spectacle, keep the narrative simple, and the world will show up. John Carter cost $250 million, most of it on effects. The alien creatures, the Martian cities, the airships, all cutting-edge CGI. Disney was trying to follow the Avatar model, create a visual world so compelling that story almost doesn't matter. But they misunderstood what made Avatar work. That film's story was simple, but it was also emotionally clear. You knew who to root for, what the stakes were, and what victory looked like. It was Dances with Wolves in space, and that familiarity was a feature, not a bug. 1. John Carter's story is anything but simple. Multiple factions on Mars, the Therns manipulating everything, Carter's fragmented backstory, the frame device. The film is structurally and narratively complex in ways that work against the spectacle. You're supposed to be dazzled by the visuals, but you're also supposed to be following political machinations and emotional arcs that require attention. The film is asking more of its audience than the blockbuster model allows, and the politics of that spectacle matter. Expensive blockbusters are conservative by nature. They need to appeal to everyone to recoup costs, so they avoid controversy. The Avengers is politically null. You can read it as pro-military or anti-authority or neither because it doesn't take a position. It's just entertaining. That's by design. Controversy limits your audience. John Carter is trying to have political content, the anti-war theme, the veteran trauma, the critique of manufactured conflict, while also being a 250 million blockbuster that needs mass appeal. Those goals are incompatible. Political content alienates portions of the audience. Blockbuster economics require not alienating anyone. The film is trying to serve two masters and fails both. This is part of why the marketing was so confused. Disney looked at the finished film and couldn't figure out how to sell political complexity as popcorn entertainment. The trailers kept trying to find the fun, the excitement, the adventure. And it's there, technically, but it's all undercut by the film's actual themes. You can't trailer cut "I'm done fighting" into an inspirational moment. It's the opposite of what adventure marketing requires. The politics of spectacle in 2012 demanded simplicity. John Carter offered complexity. That's not a marketing failure. That's a foundational incompatibility between what the film is and what the blockbuster market requires, what we couldn't face. Let's bring this back to the thesis. John Carter failed because it forced audiences to watch a film about refusing heroic violence at the exact moment American culture was trying to rehabilitate heroic violence. After a decade of morally ambiguous, politically poisoned, traumatically costly wars, the culture needed to believe that violence could still be good, that heroes could still be heroic, that strength could solve problems. The Avengers gave them that belief. John Carter denied it. The film's failure is diagnostic. It reveals what America in 2012 couldn't face, that the wars had broken something fundamental about how we understand heroism, that the volunteer military had created a class of people who bear all the costs while the rest of us consume their violence as entertainment. That causes are often hollow and systems are often corrupt, and the only thing that makes violence bearable is personal connection. That maybe after a decade of killing in service to nothing, the right response is to say, "I'm done." We couldn't face that. So we rejected the film that said it. And we embraced the film that let us pretend violence could still be fun, heroism could still be uncomplicated, and American strength could still save the day. The Avengers is a fantasy of recuperation. It gives back what the real wars took away. John Carter is a fantasy of honesty. It admits what the wars cost. In 2012, America chose recuperation. We wanted the lie. We needed the lie. And John Carter, by telling a version of the truth, became intolerable. Not because it was badly marketed or poorly made, but because it offered audiences a mirror when they wanted a window. It showed them a traumatized veteran saying, "I'm done," when they needed to believe that heroes still answer the call. The cultural context explains the commercial failure. A film that interrogates violence cannot succeed in a moment when the culture desperately needs to stop interrogating and start enjoying. John Carter arrived at exactly the wrong time with exactly the wrong message, or maybe exactly the right message that no one wanted to hear. 14 years later, after Afghanistan's chaotic withdrawal, after the forever wars finally ended in failure, after a generation of veterans came home to a country that never seriously reckoned with what it asked them to do, maybe John Carter looks different. Maybe a film about a veteran who refuses to fight, who sees through the manipulation, who recognizes that causes are often hollow and wars are often manufactured, feels less like a failure and more like a prophecy. But in March 2012, it was just a $250 million disaster that no one wanted to defend, because defending it would mean admitting what it was saying. And we weren't ready for that conversation yet. So how does the film make this argument? Because thesis without execution is just theory. If John Carter really is a covert anti-war film, that has to be visible in the filmmaking choices themselves. Not just the script, but the cinematography, the editing, the sound design, the performance direction. And it is. Once you know what to look for, the craft choices are almost too obvious. Every department is working to undermine the adventure spectacle the film pretends to be. This isn't accidental. This is Andrew Stanton and his collaborators systematically using the tools of blockbuster cinema to deconstruct blockbuster values. Let's focus on three elements where the thesis becomes technique: the visual grammar of exhaustion, the sonic absence of triumph, and the structural unreliability of memory. Each one reveals how deliberately this film is working against genre expectations. Visual grammar. Color as ideology. Start with the most obvious contrast. Earth looks like death. Mars looks like life. This isn't subtle. Cinematographer Dan Mindell shoots the American West, the Arizona Territory, wide-open frontier as desaturated, dusty, sun-bleached misery. The palette is browns and grays and washed-out blues. Everything looks tired. When Carter is on Earth, the world itself seems exhausted. Then he gets to Mars, and suddenly the film explodes with color. The Martian sky is vivid. The cities gleam. Dejah Thoris wears rich reds and golds. The alien landscapes have depth and texture. Even the deserts, because Mars is also mostly desert, feel alive in ways Earth's deserts don't. Mars is saturated. Mars is vibrant. Mars is where color exists. The obvious reading: Mars is fantasy, Earth is reality. Of course, fantasy looks better. But watch what this contrast is actually saying. Earth, the real world, America, home, is unlivable. It's drained of meaning and beauty. Carter experiences his actual existence as black and white photography in a color film. Only when he escapes to an alien planet at war does he find vibrancy. Only in the fantasy of endless conflict does the world become worth looking at. This is depression made visual grammar. For someone with severe PTSD, the real world often feels muted, distant, less real than the traumatic memories. Veterans describe this as feeling dead inside or nothing matters anymore. The vivid experiences, the ones that feel real, are the combat memories, the trauma itself. Civilian life is gray. War was color. That's a horrifying psychological state, and John Carter makes it the film's foundational aesthetic choice. So when Carter desperately tries to get back to Mars at the film's end, when his entire goal becomes returning to the planet at war, the visuals have already told us why, because that's where he's alive. Earth is death. Mars is life. The tragedy is that Mars is also violence, and the only place he can feel alive is the place that's destroying him. But the film communicates this through color timing before it ever becomes text. Now think about what this means for the spectacle. Disney spent $250 million creating the visual world of Mars. The cities, the creatures, the alien landscapes, all gorgeous, all expensive, all designed to be the selling point. But by making Earth so deliberately ugly in contrast, the film is saying something disturbing. The fantasy of war is more appealing than the reality of peace. The film is showing us the seduction of combat, why veterans struggle to come home, why Carter can't adjust to normal life. The spectacle isn't just entertainment, it's pathology. And watch the action scenes on Mars. Even there, even in the color-saturated fantasy world, the violence itself is shot without glamour. The camera doesn't linger on Carter's heroism. The fights are visceral but not celebratory. When he kills the white apes in the arena, the choreography is impressive, but the framing is almost clinical. We see the mechanics of violence, the jumps, the strength, the killing. But Mindell and Stanton refuse to make it beautiful. Compare this to how Zack Snyder shoots violence in 300, all slow motion and backlit sprays of blood. That's aestheticized combat, violence as art. John Carter shows violence as work. There's a specific moment that crystallizes this. After a major battle, there's a wide shot of bodies on the ground. It lasts maybe 3 seconds. No music, no dialogue. Just, this is what victory costs. The film spent millions on that battle sequence, and then it makes you look at the aftermath in silence. That's not how blockbusters work. Blockbusters cut from the triumph of victory to the next scene. They don't force you to witness consequence. John Carter does repeatedly. The visual grammar is saying, even in the fantasy world, even in the beautiful, color-saturated alien planet, violence is still violence. The seduction is real. Mars is genuinely more appealing than Earth. But the cost is also real. The film is trying to have it both ways, show you why someone would choose war over peace, because war feels alive, while also showing you that the choice is tragic, because war destroys you. The cinematography is doing the work of that double message. Sonic absence, what you don't hear now. Let's talk about what's missing, triumphant music. Michael Giacchino is a brilliant composer. Up, Ratatouille, Star Trek. He knows how to score adventure and emotion. But listen to how John Carter is scored, particularly in the action sequences. The music is subdued. Where you expect swelling orchestral triumph, you get tense percussion. Where you expect heroic themes, you get atmospheric ambiguity. None. The clearest example is the arena fight with the white apes. This is the sequence that's supposed to announce Carter as the hero. He's discovering his power, using his Earth strength on Mars, becoming the warrior everyone needs him to be. This should be scored like the moment Luke destroys the Death Star, or Aragorn charges at the Black Gate, massive orchestral affirmation that the hero is heroic. Instead, Giacchino gives us propulsive action music that never resolves into triumph. The percussion drives the scene, but there's no melody you leave humming. No theme that says, this is who John Carter is. Just, urgent, tense, unresolved. And after the fight, when Carter is standing among the dead apes and the Tharks are roaring approval silence or near silence, the crowd noise but no score, the film refuses to editorialize, refuses to tell you how to feel. In a traditional blockbuster, this is where the music tells the audience, cheer now, be excited. The hero has arrived. John Carter withholds that permission. The silence says, make up your own mind about whether this is good. That's a radical choice. Film scores exist to guide audience emotion. They're manipulation, openly and necessarily, but effective manipulation. When the music swells, you feel triumph whether or not the narrative has earned it. Giacchino and Stanton are refusing that manipulation in the moments where blockbuster convention demands it. They're making the violence feel ambiguous, even when it's successful. There's another sonic choice that matters, Carter's voice. Taylor Kitsch plays most of his lines flat, affectless, without the performative charisma adventure heroes require. Critics heard this as bad acting or lack of star quality, but listen to it as a specific choice. Carter sounds depressed. His voice doesn't modulate much. He doesn't do banter. When he speaks, it's functional communication, not personality. That's what clinical depression sounds like. Emotional flattening, reduced affect, disconnection from one's own voice.us. Stanton could have asked Kitsch to perform differently, could have looped lines to add energy, could have recast if the performance wasn't working. Instead, he kept the flatness because Carter isn't supposed to sound like a hero. He's supposed to sound like someone going through the motions of life without feeling it. The vocal performance is expressing pathology, not charisma. And there's a specific recurring line that encapsulates this. I'm done fighting. Watch how many times Kitsch delivers variations of this line to Powell, to Tars Tarkas, to Deja, and notice that it's always in the same exhausted tone, not defiant, not regretful, just stating a fact. The repetition makes it almost a mantra, the thing Carter has to keep saying because no one will accept it. And the delivery makes it sound like he said it so many times, he doesn't even hear the words anymore. It's just a reflex, the verbal equivalent of a defensive flinch. The sound design also does something subtle with violence. It emphasizes impact. When Carter hits something or something hits him, the sound is heavy. Thuds, cracks, the weight of bodies colliding. This isn't stylized action movie sound where punches go pow in a satisfying way. This is brutal physical contact. Listen to the arena fight again. Every impact sounds like it hurts, even when Carter's winning. The sound design is reminding you that this is bodies being damaged. Not choreography, not spectacle, damage. Compare this to the Avengers again, where the Hulk's combat sounds are almost musical, rhythmic, satisfying, even funny. When Hulk punches Thor, it's a rim shot. When John Carter fights, it sounds like meat hitting stone. One approach aestheticizes violence. The other makes you feel the cost. Giacchino and Stanton chose the cost. The sonic landscape of John Carter is essentially saying, don't get too excited, don't feel too triumphant. Remember that all of this is exhausting. That's not how you score a 250 million adventure film. That's how you score a serious drama about trauma. The genre and the sonic approach are mismatched, which is exactly the point. The mismatch is the argument. Structural unreliability. The frame as doubt. Now, the big structural choice, the framing device. The film doesn't start on Mars or even with Carter in the Old West. It starts with his nephew being summoned because Carter has died and left a manuscript. This is adapted from Burroughs' original frame, but with significant changes that make it more unreliable. The nephew named Edgar Rice Burroughs in the film, making him the author as a character, reads Carter's account, and that account becomes the movie we watch. But here's what the frame establishes. Everything we're seeing is mediated. It's Carter's story as told by Carter to his nephew. It's not objective reality. It's a narrative constructed by a traumatized man trying to explain his life to someone who wasn't there. This makes the entire film potentially unreliable. Did these events happen as Carter describes? Is Mars even real, or is it an elaborate fantasy Carter constructed to cope with trauma? The film never explicitly goes there. It's not Shutter Island or Fight Club with a twist ending that recontextualizes everything. But the frame introduces doubt into the foundation. It says, this is a story someone is telling. Stories are not truth. They're reconstructions of truth, shaped by the teller's psychology and needs. And look at what the film does with the flashbacks to Virginia, Carter's wife and child. They're not presented as complete scenes. They're fragments. A laugh, a door, fire, silence. That's how trauma memory functions. You don't remember traumatic events as coherent narratives. You remember sensory fragments that intrude without context. So when the film finally shows us the massacre's aftermath, Carter finding the bodies, it's edited as disjointed images rather than a clear sequence. This is the film using editing technique to place us inside PTSD. It's not telling us Carter is traumatized. It's showing us through the structure of memory itself. The fragmentation is the message. And by doing this, the film is acknowledging that Carter's entire narrative might be fragmented, reconstructed, unreliable. There's a specific edit that reveals this. When Carter first arrives on Mars and encounters the Tharks, there's a moment where he seems confused about how he got there. The edit suggests a gap, a missing time, a discontinuity. Now, the plot explanation is that the Thern transportation device disoriented him. But the editing makes it feel like Carter himself isn't sure what happened, like he woke up somewhere and has to reconstruct the journey. That's not how adventure films present space travel or dimensional portals. They show the journey clearly, even if it's fantastical. But John Carter makes the transition feel dissociative, like Carter is experiencing things that don't quite cohere. And if his arrival on Mars feels unreliable, what else might be? How much of this story is Carter filling in gaps in his own memory? The film never pursues this as a twist. It doesn't reveal that Mars was a delusion or a dream. But by introducing unreliability into the structure, it makes the heroism suspect. Because if we can't fully trust the narrator, we can't fully trust the hero narrative. Maybe Carter's account emphasizes his reluctance to make his eventual participation feel more noble. Maybe his description of the Thorns is his way of displacing responsibility. It wasn't his choice to fight. They manipulated everything. Maybe the whole narrative is a traumatized man trying to reframe his violence as justified. The frame story returns at the end, with Carter desperate to get back to Mars. And here's where it gets really interesting. We see Carter finding the Thern medallion, speaking the words, and then cut to black. We don't see him arrive on Mars again. We don't get confirmation that it worked. The nephew reads that Carter succeeded, but we don't see it. The film ends on the nephew's belief in the story, not on proof of the story. That's deliberate ambiguity. The film is leaving open the possibility that Carter never went back, that the ending is wish fulfillment, that the manuscript is a dying man's fantasy. It doesn't insist on this reading, but it allows for it. And by allowing for it, the film is questioning its own heroism. Is John Carter a hero who saved Mars? Or is he a traumatized veteran who constructed an elaborate narrative to give his suffering meaning? The film doesn't answer. It just presents the story and lets the frame remind you, this is someone's account, not objective truth. That structural choice undermines the entire adventure narrative foundation. You can't have an uncomplicated hero's journey if the journey itself might be a story the hero tells himself. And John Carter doesn't want an uncomplicated hero's journey. It wants you to question whether heroism is even possible, or just a narrative we construct to make violence bearable. Synthesis, craft as argument. These aren't isolated choices. The desaturated earth, the subdued score, the fragmented flashbacks, the flat vocal performance, the unreliable frame, they're all serving the same thesis. They're all saying adventure narratives lie about what violence is and what it costs. The film is using every tool available to filmmakers to undermine the genre it inhabits. That's why the craft feels off to audiences expecting adventure. The visuals are gorgeous but melancholy. The action is expensive but unsatisfying. The structure is complex but withholding. The film is systematically refusing to give audiences what blockbusters promise: escape, triumph, catharsis. Instead, it's giving them beauty that feels sad, violence that feels exhausting, and a narrative that might not even be true. This is commercially suicidal, but it's thematically essential. If the thesis is that America in 2012 couldn't face the truth about its wars, the film has to embody that truth in its craft. It has to make the violence feel costly. It has to make heroism feel suspect. It has to make fantasy feel like another form of trauma. And it does, through choices that range from obvious, the color timing, to subtle, the sonic absence after battles, to structural, the unreliable frame. Stanton and his collaborators made a film where every department understood the assignment: make a blockbuster that doesn't believe in blockbusters. Make adventure cinema that's skeptical of adventure. Make a Disney film that argues against Disney values. That's almost impossible, and the film's tonal problems are evidence of how impossible it is. But the attempt is visible in every frame. The craft is the argument made concrete, and audiences rejected it because they could feel the contradiction even if they couldn't name it. When you pay $250 million to see spectacular fantasy, you don't want the spectacle to make you feel bad. You don't want the score to refuse triumph. You don't want the hero to sound depressed. You don't want the frame to question reality. You want the Avengers, clean, triumphant, consequence-free violence you can enjoy without guilt. John Carter wouldn't give them that. Every craft choice insisted violence costs something, even in fantasy, and that insistence is why the film failed and why it matters. So what do we do with this? Because John Carter isn't getting a critical reappraisal anytime soon. It's not becoming a cult classic. It exists in cultural memory as pure disaster. The film that lost Disney $200 million, the marketing catastrophe, the cautionary tale about hubris and miscalculation. That narrative is too convenient, too useful to too many people. Film schools need examples of what not to do. Business journals need case studies in failure. The story of John Carter as expensive mistake serves purposes that the story of John Carter as subversive anti-war text never could. But accepting this reading, that the film is a disguised interrogation of America's forever war syndrome, changes what the failure means. It stops being a story about incompetent marketing and becomes a story about what audiences couldn't tolerate seeing. It stops being about Disney's mistakes and becomes about America's avoidance. The film didn't fail because no one understood it. It failed because enough people understood it, consciously or not, and rejected what it was saying. That's a harder truth than the marketing was bad. It implicates us, the audience, in the rejection. It suggests that in March 2012, American culture made a choice about what kind of blockbusters it wanted, and it chose comfortable fantasy over uncomfortable reflection. 2 months later, the Avengers proved that choice correct by making $1.5 billion, celebrating the very violence that John Carter tried to complicate. The market spoke. The verdict was clear. We wanted heroes who enjoyed being heroes. We wanted violence that felt good. We wanted to stop thinking about the cost. And we got what we wanted. The next decade of blockbusters learned the lesson John Carter taught. Don't challenge your audience. Don't make them uncomfortable. Don't import real-world trauma into fantasy spaces. Give them spectacle without consequence. Heroism without doubt, violence without cost. The MCU became the dominant cinematic force of the 2010s by perfecting that formula. Every film a slight variation on the same message. Powerful people using violence to solve problems is good, actually. No PTSD. No moral ambiguity. Just quips and triumph and post-credit scenes promising more of the same. John Carter's failure enabled that decade. It served as the example of what happens when you don't give audiences what they want. Disney lost a fortune, and the lesson was never again. Never make a blockbuster that questions blockbuster values. Never cast a depressed protagonist in an adventure film. Never make violence feel exhausting when it's supposed to feel exhilarating. The film became a negative example that enforced conformity across the industry. But here's what that means. John Carter was right, not commercially right. It failed spectacularly, but thematically, politically, morally right. It was telling the truth about what a decade of war had done to America's relationship with heroic violence, and that truth was intolerable. So the market punished it, and the industry learned to avoid truth in favor of profitable fantasy. What the reading reveals about us. If John Carter is an anti-war film that couldn't admit it was an anti-war film, what does that say about the culture that produced it? Because this wasn't an independent production or an art film. This was Disney. $250 million. Andrew Stanton, fresh off 2 Best Animated Feature Oscars. This was the studio that owns Marvel, that would go on to make Star Wars and dominate global box office. This was the mainstream, and even at the height of mainstream commercial filmmaking, even in a film designed to launch a franchise and sell toys, the reality of post-9/11 America leaked through. Stanton and his writers couldn't adapt a 1912 colonial fantasy without importing 2012's war trauma. They couldn't give Carter heroic motivation without first giving him PTSD. They couldn't stage adventure without making it feel like labor. The reality was too present, too overwhelming to be contained. That's significant. It means the trauma wasn't just affecting veterans or war opponents or political activists. It was affecting everyone, including the people making Disney blockbusters. The wars had been so long, so exhausting, so morally compromising that even a film explicitly trying to be escapist entertainment couldn't escape. The subtext became text despite every commercial incentive to keep it buried. But then audiences rejected it. We didn't want to see the truth even when it was disguised as space adventure. We didn't want a hero who says, "I'm done fighting," even though that's what many Americans were feeling by 2012. We wanted the lie back. We wanted to believe violence could be fun again, that heroes could be uncomplicated again, that American strength could solve problems without creating worse ones. The Avengers gave us that lie, and we were grateful for it. We needed it. After a decade of Abu Ghraib and Haditha and drone strikes and IEDs and veterans coming home broken, We needed to believe that violence deployed by good people for good reasons could be good. We needed the moral simplicity that the real wars had destroyed. The Avengers provided it, John Carter refused to provide it, and we punished that refusal with our wallets and our indifference. Notten. So the reading reveals this. American audiences in 2012 knew what we didn't want to think about, and we actively chose entertainment that let us avoid it. The choice wasn't passive or unconscious. We had both options in front of us, complicated violence and clean violence, and we chose clean. That's not a criticism exactly. It's human. Exhaustion seeks relief, not more exhaustion, but it's also diagnostic. It reveals the depth of the cultural fatigue, the desperate need to believe that the previous decade hadn't fundamentally changed what heroism could mean. What we gain from this interpretation. The standard narrative about John Carter is a dead end. It ends with, marketing was bad, film failed, everyone lost money, let's never do that again. There's no insight there beyond, don't sabotage your own releases. It's useful for business school case studies and useless for understanding culture. But reading the film as a covert anti-war text opens it up. Suddenly, the failure becomes meaningful. The tonal problems become explicable. The craft choices make sense. The rejection by audiences becomes culturally diagnostic rather than just economically unfortunate. The film stops being a random disaster and becomes evidence of something larger. The collision between post-9/11 reality and pre-9/11 genre conventions. This reading also rescues the film from pure dismissal. John Carter has real craft. The cinematography is often stunning. The alien designs are imaginative. The world building is ambitious. Some performances, Willem Dafoe's motion capture Tars Tarkas, for instance, are genuinely affecting. The film isn't a failure in every dimension. It's a failure of reconciling incompatible impulses, the impulse to be serious about violence and the impulse to sell $250 million worth of entertainment. Understanding that contradiction lets us appreciate what the film is rather than just lamenting what it isn't. It's not a successful adventure film, but it's a fascinating document of a cultural moment when America was too exhausted for war and too afraid of peace, caught between the reality it couldn't face and the fantasy it couldn't quite believe anymore. John Carter is that in-between space-made cinema. That's not nothing. The reading also connects the film to a lineage it otherwise seems excluded from. John Carter isn't part of the post-9/11 war film canon. That's The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, American Sniper, serious dramas that engage directly with Iraq and Afghanistan. But if we accept that John Carter is doing similar work in a different register, it becomes part of that conversation. It's the blockbuster that tried to import war film consciousness into space opera structure. It failed, but the attempt matters, and it matters now in 2026 more than it did in 2012, because we have perspective now that we didn't then. Afghanistan ended in chaotic withdrawal. The forever wars finally ended, not with victory, but with exhaustion and retreat. The veterans of those wars are still coming to terms with what was asked of them and what it achieved. The culture is finally, slowly beginning to reckon with the costs in ways it wasn't ready to in 2012. From this vantage point, John Carter looks prophetic. A film about a veteran who refuses to fight, who sees through the manipulation, who recognizes that grand causes are often hollow and wars are often manufactured by parties who profit from continuation. That's not 2012 hindsight. That's 2012 foresight that audiences weren't ready to accept. The film was arguing in 2012 what most Americans wouldn't accept until the 2020s, that the wars were mistakes, that the costs were unbearable, and that the only sane response was to say, "I'm done." Carter says it over and over. The film makes it his defining characteristic, and we rejected him for it. Maybe because we knew, on some level, that he was right. The Rewatch challenge. So here's the provocation. Watch John Carter again, not as a failed adventure film, not as a marketing disaster. Watch it as a film about post-traumatic stress disorder disguised as space opera. Watch it as a film where every choice, Visual, sonic, structural is designed to make violence feel costly rather than cathartic. Watch it knowing that the film is arguing against its own genre from the inside. Watch the opening and notice that it begins with death and isolation. Watch Carter's first scenes on Earth and count how many times he tries to escape conscription. Watch how Taylor Kitsch plays every scene with the affect of clinical depression. Watch how the film color times Earth as death and Mars as life, and ask yourself what that says about where traumatized veterans feel real. Watch the arena fight and notice the absence of triumphant music. Watch the battles and notice how the camera refuses to make violence beautiful. Watch Carter's face during combat and see if you can find joy anywhere in it. Watch the film withhold the satisfactions that adventure films are supposed to provide. Watch the Therns and recognize them as war profiteers, as the 1% who benefit from the 99% sacrifice, as the puppet masters who keep conflicts running because peace is unprofitable. Watch Carter get recruited by both sides and recognize the military recruitment tactics, the appeals to duty and honor and purpose that he's learned to see through. Watch the Virginia flashbacks and notice they're edited as trauma memory, fragments, intrusions, incomplete. Watch the framing device and notice it makes the entire narrative potentially unreliable. Watch the ending and notice it doesn't give you confirmation, just faith in a story a traumatized man told his nephew. Watch all of this and ask, is this a failed adventure film? Or is this an anti-war film that failed because audiences in 2012 couldn't accept what it was saying? The film doesn't change based on your answer, but what you see in it does. And what you see in its failure does? If it's just bad marketing, the failure is Disney's problem. If it's cultural rejection of an inconvenient truth, the failure is ours. We're the ones who chose the Avengers over this. We're the ones who needed the lie. What it means that we're still not talking about it? 14 years later, the conversation about John Carter hasn't evolved. It's still bad marketing, huge loss, what a disaster. Even the defenders, the people who say it's unfairly maligned, mostly just argue that it's a competent adventure film that deserved better. They're not engaging with what makes it strange, what makes it uncomfortable, what makes it different from every other blockbuster of its era. That continued avoidance is revealing. We still don't want to talk about what this film is actually doing, because talking about it means confronting what we wanted from our blockbusters in 2012 and what that says about us. It means admitting that we chose comfortable fantasy over complicated truth. It means recognizing that the film industry learned exactly the wrong lesson from John Carter's failure. Not be more honest about violence, but never challenge your audience. The MCU's dominance, the decade-plus of superhero films that perfected consequence-free, spectacular violence, the way blockbusters became more and more like theme park rides and less like films that engage with reality, all of that is downstream of John Carter's failure. The film served as a warning. This is what happens when you don't give audiences what they want. And what they want, the market concluded, is escape, not reflection. But the question the film raises doesn't go away just because we've been avoiding it for 14 years. What do we do with heroic violence after the reality of violence has been revealed as unheroic? How do we tell adventure stories when adventure has been unmasked as trauma? How do we celebrate military strength when military strength has failed to solve the problems it promised to solve? John Carter tried to answer by making a film where heroism was painful, where violence was exhausting, where the only acceptable reason to fight was intimate personal connection rather than abstract ideals. And the market said, no thank you, we'll take the Hulk-smashing Loki instead. We're still living in that choice. The blockbusters we've gotten for the past decade plus are the result of John Carter teaching Hollywood the wrong lesson. We could have had a cinema that engaged seriously with violence even in fantasy contexts. We could have had heroes who struggled with the cost of heroism. We could have had blockbusters that respected their audiences enough to challenge them. Instead, we got formulaic spectacle that asks nothing and provides exactly what it promises: 2 hours of not thinking about anything real. That's not worthless. Escapism has value, especially to exhausted people living through difficult times, but it's also not enough, and it's definitely not all that cinema can be. The final question John Carter asks: what if the hero is done? What if the veteran has seen enough, fought enough, lost enough, and just wants to be left alone? What if I'm done fighting is the sanest response to a world of endless manufactured conflicts that serve purposes the fighters never understand and causes that collapse under scrutiny? The film doesn't have a clean answer. Carter does fight again, but only for personal love, and the film's ending suggests he can't live in peacetime, that he's only fully alive when he's back in the war. That's not triumphant. That's tragic. The film is saying, this is what we've done to people. We've made them incompatible with peace. We've made violence the only place they feel real. And in 2012, we didn't want to hear that. We wanted heroes who believed in the mission. We wanted violence that felt good. We wanted to stop thinking about what the real wars cost and who paid those costs. The Avengers let us stop thinking. John Carter demanded we keep thinking. We chose accordingly. But the question remains, especially now, in 2026, after Afghanistan's end, after the reckoning that still hasn't fully happened, after a generation of veterans trying to make sense of what they were asked to do and what it achieved, the question remains: what do we owe the people we send to fight? What do we owe ourselves as a culture that consumes violence as entertainment? What does it mean that we prefer the fantasy violence to any engagement with real consequence? John Carter is a flawed film that tried to ask those questions while also being a $250 million Disney blockbuster. The contradiction killed it, but the questions survive. And maybe, finally, we're ready to answer them, or at least stop pretending they don't exist. Rewatch John Carter and see if you can find the film underneath the failure. The one that was too honest for its own good, that tried to tell the truth about violence in a genre built on lies about violence, that gave us a traumatized veteran as a space hero and expected us to accept him. We didn't in 2012. Maybe we can now. The film's asking, are you done fighting? Are you ready to see through the manipulation? Are you willing to accept that the only reasons worth fighting for are personal, intimate, human, not abstract causes or grand narratives or national myths? John Carter said yes to those questions and failed for it. What's your answer? Everyone talks about adaptation fidelity like it's neutral, like filmmakers either honor the source material or betray it, and the choice is about respect versus creative license. That's not how it works. When you're adapting a 1912 colonial fantasy for 2012 audiences, fidelity isn't even an option. The original text is ideologically toxic. Its assumptions are intolerable. Its hero is a war criminal by contemporary standards. So every adaptation choice becomes a political choice about what values to preserve and what to discard. Andrew Stanton and his co-writers made those choices consciously, systematically, and radically. They kept Edgar Rice Burroughs' plot structure: man goes to Mars, fights aliens, wins princess, but they inverted nearly every character motivation, every thematic assumption, every ideological value the original text holds. The result isn't a faithful adaptation that happened to fail. It's a deliberate subversion that uses Burroughs' narrative skeleton to argue against everything Burroughs believed. And the proof is in the changes, not the changes you'd expect. Updating dialogue, modernizing pacing, adding effects-driven spectacle. The fundamental changes to who John Carter is, what he wants, why he fights, and what the story means. Line those changes up next to the original text, and you're not looking at adaptation. You're looking at ideological warfare disguised as blockbuster entertainment. Who is John Carter? Book versus film. Start with the protagonist himself. Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter, introduced in A Princess of Mars, 1912, is a Virginia gentleman, a Confederate cavalry officer, and an enthusiastic warrior round. The novel establishes him in the opening pages as someone who thrives in combat. He doesn't question fighting, he doesn't avoid conflict. Violence is his natural element. After the Civil War ends, he heads west, not for peace, but for more adventure prospecting for gold in Apache territory, where he'll inevitably get into more fights. That's who he is, a man defined by competence in violence, comfortable with combat, seeking situations where that competence matters. The novel never presents this as problematic. Carter is heroic because he's good at killing. His battlefield prowess is what makes him worthy. When he arrives on Mars through unexplained mystical means, his first instinct isn't confusion or fear. It's tactical assessment. He figures out the lower gravity gives him superhuman strength and jumping ability, and his immediate thought is, this is useful for fighting. He's excited about it. He's found a new arena for the thing he's best at, and Burroughs loves him for this. The narration, Carter is telling his own story, but Burroughs' values are transparent treats. Carter's warrior nature as ideal masculinity. He's noble because he's deadly. He's honorable because he follows a code even while killing efficiently. He rises through Thark society not through diplomacy or cultural exchange, but through winning arena combats and proving he's the strongest. The Tharks respect him because he's a better warrior than they are. That's the logic. Might makes right, and the mightiest is the most right. When Carter sees Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Helium, for the first time, he falls instantly in love and immediately commits to protecting her through violence. He doesn't question whether the conflict between Helium and Zodanga is justified. He doesn't ask what the war is about. He chooses a side based on who has the attractive woman and starts killing for that side. The novel treats this as romantic. His love justifies unlimited violence on her behalf. He'll slaughter hundreds to save her, and that's heroism. Now watch what the film does to this character. Taylor Kitsch's John Carter is introduced in exactly the opposite mode, refusing to fight. The film opens post-Civil War with Carter actively avoiding conscription. When Colonel Powell, his former commanding officer and friend, tries to recruit him for the Apache campaigns, Carter says no. When he's arrested and forced into service, he escapes. When he's recaptured, he escapes again. The entire first act is about a man doing everything possible to avoid being a soldier. That's the foundational change. This Carter doesn't want to fight. He's done with it. He's running from it. And the film gives him a reason Burroughs never provided: Virginia, the wife and child who were killed. This backstory doesn't exist in the source material. It's a pure invention, and it's crucial because it transforms Carter from an enthusiastic warrior to a traumatized veteran. It gives him PTSD to explain his refusal. It makes his cynicism about causes and duties psychologically justified. The film literalizes trauma as the origin of his character, and trauma is what Burroughs Carter never experiences. Book Carter loves war. Film Carter is broken by it. Why? Watch the scene where Carter is forced into the cavalry unit and immediately starts planning his escape. He's not conflicted about deserting. He's determined. This isn't heroic reluctance, the classic "I don't want to be the chosen one" that the hero overcomes. This is active resistance to being instrumentalized. He's refusing to be a weapon that the military deploys. And his refusal is treated as legitimate by the film's perspective. We're not watching a coward who needs to find courage. We're watching someone who's seen enough to know better than to believe in military glory. When Film Carter says, "I'm done fighting," he means it. When Book Carter fights, he's alive. That inversion is everything. It's the thesis-made character. You cannot faithfully adapt a character whose core trait is love of combat into a character whose core trait is exhaustion from combat. Those are opposite people. Stanton kept the name, the setting, the basic plot, and changed the soul. The Virginia invention, manufacturing justification. Let's focus on this because it's the most revealing change. Virginia Carter's wife and child, their cabin, the massacre that kills them, none of this is in Burroughs. The novel gives Carter a mysterious past. He's apparently immortal, remembers no childhood, and has been adult for as long as he can recall. That's it. No family, no dead loved ones, no trauma origin story. He's just an archetypal warrior who exists to fight. Lewis. Stanton and his co-writers couldn't work with that. A modern audience needs psychology. They need reason. You can't just have a character who hates fighting without explaining why, especially when the source material has him loving it. So they manufactured Virginia, the idealized domestic life, then its violent destruction, to give Carter trauma that justifies his transformation. Look at how the Virginia flashbacks are structured. They're not complete scenes. They're fragments, a woman laughing, a door opening, flames, silence. That's not exposition about Carter's backstory. That's PTSD intrusion. The editing mimics how traumatic memories actually function, sensory fragments that crash into consciousness without narrative coherence. The film isn't telling us Carter had a wife and child. It's showing us how that loss has fractured his psychological continuity. And notice what gets revealed when we don't learn about Virginia immediately. The information comes in pieces, triggered by moments that parallel the trauma. When Carter sees Deja in danger, when violence threatens someone he's starting to care about, that's when the Virginia memories intrude. The film is structuring revelation around psychological realism rather than narrative convenience. We learn about the trauma when Carter is forced to confront it, not when the plot needs backstory. This invention does something crucial. It makes Carter's refusal sympathetic. Without Virginia, a protagonist who won't help people in danger looks like a coward or a nihilist. With Virginia, he's a traumatized veteran who's already lost everything and can't bear to risk caring again. The backstory reframes, "I'm done fighting," from cowardice to self-preservation. It's the difference between someone who's afraid and someone who's already been destroyed once and knows they can't survive it again. But here's the deeper implication. By inventing this trauma, the film is saying that you need trauma to justify refusing to fight. That refusal isn't legitimate on its own. You need to have been broken first. That's actually pretty dark. The film can't imagine a hero who simply chooses not to be violent. He has to be damaged into that choice. It's saying that in American culture, pacifism or refusal requires pathology as explanation. You can't just opt out. You have to be too wounded to participate. That's diagnostic. It reveals that even a film trying to critique military culture can't fully escape its logic. The film wants Carter's refusal to be valid, but it also needs to justify that refusal through suffering. It can't present, "I don't want to fight," as sufficient reason. It needs, "I've been destroyed by fighting," as the real reason. That concession to genre expectations undermines the more radical possibility. What if someone just stopped? What if you could refuse without needing trauma as permission? The Virginia invention is evidence that Stanton knew he was making an anti-war film, but also knew he couldn't make it too anti-war. He needed to give audiences a reason to accept Carter's refusal that didn't threaten the broader cultural assumption that fighting is what heroes do. So he gave Carter tragedy. And tragedy, in American cinema, excuses almost anything, including the refusal to be heroic. The Therns, from minor villains to systemic critique. In Burroughs' novels, the Therns are a race of white-skinned Martians who perpetuate a religious hoax. They pose as gods, control a false paradise, and feed on pilgrims who believe in the afterlife they've invented. They appear primarily in the second book of the series. They're villains, but localized ones, a cult, not a system. Their evil is personal and containable. Carter can fight them and win. In Stanton's film, the Thorns are something else entirely, puppet masters orchestrating Mars's entire geopolitical situation for their own purposes. Mark Strong's Matai Shang isn't a cult leader, he's a manipulator who's been extending the war between Helium and Zodanga for generations. He gives weapons to one side, intelligence to the other. He doesn't want victory. He wants equilibrium, endless conflict that serves his civilization's mysterious agenda. This is a wholesale reimagining that transforms the politics of the story. Suddenly, the war isn't a tragic conflict between civilizations. It's manufactured, it's maintained. Someone profits from its continuation, and that someone is working behind the scenes to make sure peace never arrives. The film takes a straightforward adventure plot and injects conspiracy, systemic manipulation, and the suggestion that all wars serve purposes the warriors never understand. Ds. The Therns become, essentially, the military-industrial complex. They're Halliburton, they're the profiteers who benefit from endless war while others pay the cost. And the film makes this textually explicit. Matai Shang talks about managing civilizations, about cycles of rise and fall, about his people's role as gardeners culling excess. He uses the language of inevitability, of realpolitik, of this is just how things work. It's the exact rhetoric used to justify American military interventions. We're not causing the chaos, we're managing it. We're not profiting from war, we're providing stability. That's a radical injection of contemporary political critique into a pulp adventure framework. Burroughs had no interest in questioning whether the Mars conflicts were justified. They were just backdrop for heroic action. But Stanton makes the question central. Who benefits from this war? Why does it continue? What if the real enemy isn't the obvious villain, but the system that keeps producing villains to fight? And this changes Carter's arc fundamentally. In the book, Carter chooses a side and fights. Simple. In the film, Carter is being manipulated by the Therns even as he thinks he's making free choices. The medallion that brought him to Mars? Thern technology. His arrival isn't accident or fate, it's intervention. The Therns wanted him there for reasons he doesn't understand. So when he finally chooses to fight, is it really his choice? Or is he playing a role in someone else's script? The film doesn't answer cleanly, but asking the question is the point. By making the Therns into systemic manipulators rather than individual villains, the film is arguing that heroic violence might always serve purposes beyond the hero's understanding. You think you're fighting for love or justice or survival, but you're actually serving someone else's agenda. That's not adventure story logic. That's anti-war film logic. It's Three Kings or The Hurt Locker, not Star Wars. This change alone proves the adaptation isn't about fidelity. It's about importing 2012's political consciousness into 1912's narrative frame. And the frame can't hold. The film wants to be both adventure and critique, wants Carter to be both hero and pawn, wants the violence to be both spectacular and suspect. The Therns are where that contradiction becomes structural. Colonialist text to anti-colonial subtext. Let's be direct about what Burroughs was writing. A Princess of Mars is colonial fantasy. It's about a white American arriving on an alien world and immediately becoming more important than everyone who was already there. Carter is stronger, smarter, more capable than the Martians he encounters. He rises to leadership not through learning their ways, but through imposing his superiority. The Tharks, the green, four-armed Martians, are coded as savage, violent, honor-obsessed, lacking civilization. Carter brings order. The red Martians of Helium are more advanced, but they still need Carter to save them. The white man arrives and becomes indispensable. This is manifest destiny in space. It's the frontier myth exported to other planets. It's every assumption of early 20th century American imperialism. We're more advanced, more capable, more deserving of power, and wherever we go, we improve things through our presence. Burroughs wasn't being subtle about this. It's the text, not the subtext. Stanton can't film that straight. A 2012 audience would rightly see it as repellent. So the film has to navigate around the colonialism while keeping the plot structure that depends on it. The result is a strange compromise. Carter is still the most powerful fighter on Mars, still becomes crucial to the outcome, still wins the princess. But the film tries to make his dominance feel uncomfortable rather than triumphant. Notice how Carter's fighting prowess is framed. In the book, it's exhilarating. He discovers his power and revels in it. In the film, he fights efficiently but without joy. His strength is portrayed as something he wishes he didn't need to use. The film is trying to preserve the spectacle of Carter as warrior while undercutting the ideology that makes that spectacle heroic. It doesn't fully succeed. You can't make a 250 million blockbuster about a white savior figure and completely escape the colonialism inherent in that structure. But you can see the film struggling against its own foundations. The unease audiences felt, the sense that something was off. That's the film fighting with its source material's ideology. The clearest evidence is Carter's arc. Book Carter embraces Mars. He becomes John Carter of Mars, warlord, defender of Barsoom. He finds his purpose. Film Carter spends most of the runtime trying to leave Mars. He wants to go back to Earth. He rejects the role of savior until the last possible moment, and even then he only fights for personal reasons, not to become their leader. The film is resisting the colonial fantasy even while structurally depending on it. That tension is untenable. It's why the film feels confused, why the tone is inconsistent, why audiences couldn't figure out what they were watching. The source material is ideologically incompatible with contemporary values, but it's also the reason the film exists. Disney wanted the IP, the built-in story, the franchise potential. You can't fully reject the ideology and keep the plot. So the film tries to have it both ways and succeeds at neither. What the changes prove. Forensic adaptation analysis reveals intent. When you change dialogue or pacing, that's craft. When you change the protagonist's fundamental motivation and the story's ideological foundation, that's argument. And the argument Stanton is making through his changes is clear. Burroughs' colonialist warrior fantasy is intolerable in post-9/11 America, so we'll keep the surface and replace the substance with its opposite. Carter goes from loving war to hating it. The trauma that doesn't exist in the source material gets invented. The villains transform from individual bad actors to systemic manipulators. The hero's journey gets reframed as reluctant participation in someone else's agenda. Every major change moves the story from triumphalist adventure to skeptical deconstruction. This isn't accidental. This isn't just updating for modern audiences. This is taking a text that celebrates American imperial violence and turning it into a text that questions all violence, all causes, all heroic narratives. That's ideological warfare conducted through adaptation choices, and it proves the thesis. You don't make these changes if you're just trying to adapt a fun adventure story. You make these changes if you're trying to say something about war, trauma, manipulation, and the hollowness of heroic violence. Stanton used Burroughs' plot as a Trojan horse to smuggle in an anti-war message. The film failed because audiences could sense the bait and switch even if they couldn't articulate it. The source material is the evidence. Everything that changed reveals what Stanton actually wanted to make, a serious film about refusing to fight, dressed up as a blockbuster about fighting. The disguise didn't work, but the attempt is visible in every deviation from Burroughs. The adaptation is the argument. Rewatch it now, not in 2012, when it was released into a culture still pretending the wars could be justified. In 2026, after Afghanistan's collapse, after the chaotic Kabul withdrawal, after 2 decades of forever war finally ended in failure so complete that even the architects admitted defeat, watch John Carter from this side of history and tell me it doesn't look different. Tell me John Carter saying, "I'm done fighting," doesn't hit harder when you know that's exactly how America felt 3 years ago. Pulling out of Kabul and leaving behind everyone who helped us, admitting through action, if not words, that none of it meant anything. The film hasn't changed, we have. And that distance, those 14 years between March 2012 and now, reveals what John Carter actually was. Not a failed adventure film, but an early warning about contradictions the culture wasn't ready to acknowledge. It was prophetic, and we punished it for being right too soon. What? 2012 couldn't see March 2012. Iraq had officially ended 3 months earlier. Afghanistan was still fully engaged, but troop levels were drawing down from the 2010 surge. The political narrative was that we were winding down the wars, finding responsible ways to exit, transitioning to Afghan security forces. There was still the pretense of achievable objectives. The discourse was about how to leave, not whether the entire enterprise had been a catastrophic mistake. American culture in that moment was exhausted, but not yet willing to admit defeat. War fatigue was real. People were tired of deployments, tired of casualties, tired of news coverage from Kandahar and Fallujah. But there was still investment in the idea that the wars had meant something, that the sacrifice had been for a purpose, that we couldn't just walk away without dishonoring everyone who'd served. Into that moment, John Carter released with a protagonist who'd already reached the conclusion America wouldn't reach for another decade, that the only sane response to endless war is refusal, that causes are hollow, that the machinery grinds forward regardless of individual sacrifice, that the systems manipulating conflict for profit don't care about the warriors who bleed for abstract goals. Carter had learned in the 1860s what America would learn in the 2020s. You can win every battle and still lose the war, because the war was never designed to be won. But in 2012, that was intolerable. Veterans were still being told their service mattered, that the mission was important, that withdrawal didn't mean failure. The culture needed to believe that even if the wars were badly managed, they were fundamentally justified. John Carter offered a protagonist who'd seen through that narrative and rejected it entirely. A protagonist who looked at people asking him to fight and said, "No, I've seen this before. I know how it ends. I'm not doing it again." Audiences rejected him, because accepting him meant accepting that refusal was legitimate, that walking away was sane, that "I'm done" was the right answer. And in 2012, we couldn't accept that yet. We needed 2 more decades of failure first. August 2021, the prophecy fulfilled. Then came Kabul, August 2021. The chaotic American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Helicopters evacuating the embassy. Afghans falling from planes. The Taliban retaking the country in days. 20 years of war, trillions of dollars, tens of thousands dead, and the outcome was total failure. Everything we'd said we were fighting for, democracy, women's rights, preventing terrorist safe havens, collapsed in less than a week. The Afghanistan government we built dissolved like it had never existed. The military we'd trained for 2 decades surrendered almost without fighting. And the American response wasn't outrage or determination to re-engage. It was exhaustion, relief even. The war was over, we'd lost, but at least it was done. The political discourse wasn't, "How could we let this happen?" but "Why did we stay so long?" The reckoning wasn't about failure to achieve objectives. It was about whether we should have had those objectives in the first place. That's when America collectively said, "I'm done fighting." Not officially. No president stood up and said, "The wars were mistakes and everyone who died for nothing." But the cultural consensus shifted. Suddenly, the skeptics who'd been called unpatriotic for 2 decades were vindicated. Suddenly, the veterans who'd come home and said, "I don't know what we were doing there," were speaking obvious truth. Suddenly, the only people who looked foolish were the ones still defending the enterprise. The forever wars ended not with victory or even honorable stalemate, but with admission that the entire project had been founded on delusions. That nation building was hubris. That military solutions to political problems don't work. That the costs in blood, money, moral standing, and psychic damage to everyone involved vastly exceeded anything resembling benefit. America didn't learn these lessons gracefully. We learned them through humiliating failure broadcast globally, and suddenly, 9 years after it bombed, John Carter looks prophetic. A film about a veteran who refuses to fight because he's seen this before, who won't be recruited for someone else's war, who recognizes that grand causes are often manipulated by parties with hidden agendas, who only fights when personal connection, not abstract duty, gives him reason. That's not a failed adventure hero. That's every veteran who came back from Iraq or Afghanistan and said never again. The film was early, the film was right, and the film was punished for being right before the culture was ready to admit it. Veteran discourse. Then and now, in 2012, veterans who opposed the wars or questioned their service were marginalized. Organizations like Iraq Veterans Against the War existed but were treated as fringe, as people who couldn't handle combat or who'd been radicalized by anti-American influences. The dominant narrative was still support the troops, which functionally meant don't question the wars. To honor veterans meant to honor their missions. To suggest the missions were unjustified meant disrespecting the people who fought them. That made John Carter's refusal doubly problematic. He's explicitly a veteran Civil War, but coded through every choice as contemporary. And he's saying the thing you weren't allowed to say in 2012, I don't owe you my violence. I've served, I'm done. The causes you're asking me to fight for aren't my causes. The wars you want me to participate in aren't worth fighting. Leave me alone. That was too threatening to the culture's need to believe that military service was inherently noble and that veterans should be willing to serve again if asked. Carter's refusal implied that service could teach you to refuse further service, that seeing combat could make you opposed to combat. That experience could lead to rejection rather than commitment. The culture wasn't ready for veterans who'd learned the wrong lessons. By 2026, veteran discourse has transformed. PTSD and moral injury are mainstream concepts. The veteran suicide rate is openly discussed as a policy failure. Books and documentaries by veterans questioning their service are respected rather than dismissed. There's cultural space now for the veteran who says, I'm not sure any of that was worth it. The taboo has weakened. John Carter gives us that veteran before that space existed. Taylor Kitsch's performance flat affect, minimal emotional range, exhaustion as baseline reads differently now. In 2012, critics called it wooden. In 2026, it looks like accurate portrayal of depression and PTSD. The film was showing what the culture wasn't ready to see. The veteran who can't fake enthusiasm for heroism anymore, who's gone numb to the rhetoric that sent him to war, who just wants to be left alone. And the Virginia backstory. The dead family that justifies Carter's refusal looks less like emotional manipulation and more like acknowledgement that the culture requires tragedy as permission for refusal. You can't just not want to fight. You have to be too broken to fight. That limitation was true in 2012 and remains true now. But at least now there's acknowledgement that breaking happens, that combat creates trauma, that the cost lasts lifetimes. John Carter was depicting post-traumatic stress before the culture had language to discuss it at scale. The film failed partly because audiences didn't understand they were watching a PTSD narrative disguised as space adventure. Now we might. Too late for the film's commercial prospects, but not too late for the reading. The superhero correction that didn't happen. Remember the comparison. John Carter failed in March 2012. The Avengers succeeded 2 months later. That comparison seemed to prove that audiences wanted uncomplicated heroism, consequence-free violence, spectacle without psychological cost. And for the next decade plus, Hollywood delivered exactly that. The MCU dominated global box office by perfecting the formula, powerful people using violence to solve problems, with quips, with fun, with barely a pause to acknowledge collateral damage. It worked. Billions of dollars proved it worked. Film after film, the same structure, assemble heroes, give them a clear enemy, stage spectacular battles, end with triumph. No ambiguity, no PTSD, no questioning whether violence actually solves anything. The few attempts to inject seriousness. Iron Man 3's PTSD subplot, Captain America, Civil War's debate about oversight were quickly resolved in favor of heroes should be free to use violence as they see fit. The formula was sacred, but by 2025, superhero fatigue set in. Box office returns declined. Audiences stopped showing up automatically. The films that succeeded were the ones that broke formula. Deadpool and Wolverine's meta-commentary, for instance. The ones that failed were the ones that kept repeating the pattern with diminishing returns. After a decade plus of consequence-free spectacular violence, audiences were exhausted. John Carter warned this would happen. Not explicitly, not intentionally, but structurally. The film tried to make violence feel costly and exhausting, and it failed commercially. The industry learned, never do that. Make violence fun. Make heroism uncomplicated. Give audiences escape, not reflection. And for a decade, that worked, until it stopped working because repeated exposure to the same formula creates diminishing returns. You can only watch the same story so many times before you need something else. The correction John Carter tried to make in 2012, importing psychological realism into blockbuster violence, is the correction the genre needs now. But the film's failure meant Hollywood learned the opposite lesson. Instead of make blockbusters more honest about violence, the industry learned never challenge your audience. The result was a decade of increasingly hollow spectacle that eventually exhausted even the audiences who wanted it. If John Carter had succeeded, if audiences had accepted a protagonist who hated fighting and a narrative that questioned heroic violence, maybe the superhero genre would have evolved differently. Maybe we'd have gotten more complex, psychologically honest blockbusters. Maybe the exhaustion would have arrived sooner, but with more interesting alternatives available. Instead, the film's failure enforced orthodoxy, and the genre calcified into formula. Now, in 2026, superhero fatigue suggests audiences are ready for what John Carter offered: blockbusters that engage seriously with the costs of violence, heroes who struggle with the weight of heroism, narratives that question whether violence actually solves the problems it claims to solve. But the film that tried to deliver that in 2012 was rejected so thoroughly that no one's trying again. The lessons stuck, and the genre has suffered for it. The War Profiteer Prophecy. The Therns, the puppet master aliens manipulating Mars's wars for their own purposes, felt like heavy-handed allegory in 2012. They're too obviously the military-industrial complex, too clearly standing in for Halliburton and Blackwater and all the contractors who profited from reconstruction and security contracts. It felt unsubtle, like Stanton hitting you over the head with political critique in a film that was supposed to be fun. But look at the discourse in 2026. The Afghanistan Papers revealed systematic lying about war progress. Profit motives in defense contracting are openly discussed. The observation that certain parties benefit from endless war is mainstream political analysis now, not fringe conspiracy theory. What felt unsubtle in 2012 looks like accurate diagnosis in 2026. The Therns say they're managing civilizations, providing stability, performing a necessary function. That's exactly the rhetoric used to justify American military presence abroad. We're not conquering, we're stabilizing. We're not profiting, we're providing security. The necessity of our violence is self-evident. The Therns make that rhetoric villainous, and in 2012 it felt cartoonish. In 2026, after 2 decades of for-profit warfare that enriched contractors while achieving nothing resembling the stated objectives, it looks prophetic. John Carter was arguing in 2012 that wars are often manufactured and maintained by parties who profit from their continuation, that the warriors fighting those wars don't understand the larger agendas they're serving, that the stated causes are often covers for unstated interests. This wasn't popular analysis in 2012. You could say it in academic papers or activist circles, but not in 250 million blockbuster. The film tried anyway and was rejected partly for this reason. Now, it's consensus. Now, even mainstream politicians acknowledge that the forever wars serve contractor profits more than national security. that reconstruction funds were often graft, that the whole enterprise was corrupt from conception. The Therns aren't unsubtle allegory anymore. They're accurate representation of dynamics we now openly acknowledge. The film was prophetic. It showed us the machinery before we were willing to see it, and we rejected the film for showing us what we'd eventually have to admit was true. What the distance teaches us 14 years gives perspective. From 2026, looking back at John Carter's 2012 failure, we can see what wasn't visible then. The film was caught in a specific cultural moment when America was between denial and acceptance. Too late for pre-9/11 uncomplicated heroism, too early for post-Afghanistan reckoning. The film offered a protagonist who'd already reached conclusions the culture wouldn't reach for another decade, and the culture punished it for being early. That's not the film's failure. That's the culture's. John Carter was trying to have a conversation audiences weren't ready for, about what war costs, about when refusal is legitimate, about how systems manipulate individuals into violence that serves agendas they don't understand, about why a veteran might say, "I'm done," and mean it as sanity rather than cowardice. The conversation has arrived. The questions John Carter raised in 2012 are the questions we're asking in 2026. What do we owe veterans? What did the wars achieve? Who profited while others paid costs? Is military violence the solution to the problems we think it is? Can we build a culture that respects refusal as much as service? John Carter doesn't have clean answers, but it asked the questions before asking, was acceptable, and it suffered commercially for asking early. The reappraisal won't come. The film is too expensive, too compromised, too structurally confused to become a cult classic. It will remain a notorious flop in film history, but the reading matters. Understanding what it tried to do, why it failed, and how the distance makes its arguments visible, that has value. Not for the film's reputation, which is unsalvageable, for understanding what America couldn't face in 2012 and what we're finally facing now. The necessary failure final provocation. What if John Carter had to fail? What if its commercial disaster was necessary to prove the point it was making? Because the thesis isn't just that America rejected an anti-war message in 2012. It's that the blockbuster form itself, 250 million budgets, global audiences, franchise ambitions, is incompatible with serious political critique. You can't make that much money challenging your audience. You can't launch a franchise with a protagonist who refuses the hero's journey. You can't sell toys for a film about PTSD. John Carter tried to split the difference, be a blockbuster and a critique, entertainment and argument, spectacle and skepticism. It failed at both, and maybe that failure proves that you can't have it both ways. That serious political cinema and blockbuster entertainment are fundamentally different things with different requirements, that the form determines what messages it can carry. If that's true, then John Carter's failure wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable structural collapse under incompatible demands. And it revealed something important. The blockbuster, as form, is conservative, is resistant to challenge, is designed to comfort rather than confront. You can make great films at that budget level. You can't make honest films about what violence costs. So John Carter failed. And its failure taught Hollywood, never try this again. Make your blockbusters uncomplicated. Give audiences escape. Don't make them think about real wars while watching fantasy violence. The lesson stuck, and the result was a decade of increasingly hollow spectacle. But maybe that decade of hollowness has prepared audiences for something else. Maybe after superhero fatigue, after fantasy exhaustion, after a decade of consequence-free violence, we're ready for blockbusters that engage honestly with what violence is and what it costs. Maybe John Carter's failure was necessary, had to happen first, had to clear the ground, had to show what doesn't work so that something better could eventually emerge. The film failed in 2012 because it was early. It tried to have a conversation the culture wasn't ready for. 14 years later, the conversation has arrived. The film won't be reclaimed, but its questions remain. And maybe that's enough. Watch it again. See what 14 Years of Distance reveals. Not a failed adventure film, but an early warning we weren't ready to hear. About what war costs. About when refusal is sanity. About how long it takes a culture to admit it was wrong. John Carter said, "I'm done fighting" in 2012. America said it in 2021. Better late than never. But the film was first.